Hey everyone, let's grow the creepy crew together. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. Thank you so much to all my amazing subscribers. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment. The heat hit me like a wall every time I stepped outside around noon, and that was especially true near the old warehouse behind our house. We had just moved into this small, quiet town at the end of the school year, renting a plain one-story place right next to that decaying building. The roof of it was rusted through in patches, and it always gave off this weird, burnt metal smell when the sun was high. During the first few days, I mostly wandered around by myself, walking slowly down our street, looking at the dusty pickup trucks parked crookedly in front of houses. Nobody seemed to be in a rush here. The air was dry, and the loudest sounds in the afternoons were cicadas and the occasional hum of lawnmowers. I didn't know anyone yet, so I kept to myself. Most of the houses had drawn curtains, and the only people I'd seen were older folks sitting on porches, fanning themselves and barely nodding when I passed by. I'd walk past the warehouse, cut across the empty lot behind it, and follow a path that led nowhere in particular. One afternoon, while I was tracing that same route, I noticed a kid about my age sitting on the edge of the lot, tossing a rock up and down. He looked up, gave me a nod, and then waved me over. "You new here?" he asked, not waiting for an answer before adding, "There's a little lake behind those trees. You want to see it?" I hesitated but followed him. He didn't seem threatening, and I had nothing better to do. The trail behind the lot was overgrown but manageable. After a short walk, we reached a small lake, more like a big pond really, with murky green water and a few old plastic chairs left near the edge. He pointed at a spot where the ground dipped down to the water and said that's where they usually fish. "You should get a rod," he said. "The shop on the corner sells them cheap. We come out here a lot, hang out, skip stones. Not much else to do." That's pretty much how it started. I went to the corner store the next day, bought a cheap rod, and started joining him in the evenings. We'd sit by the water, talking about random stuff, school, music, whatever, and tossing stones just to see how many skips we could get. A couple other kids would ride by sometimes on old bikes, sometimes stopping to say hi, sometimes just passing through. No one seemed to be in a rush. The whole place had this slow, still rhythm to it, like time didn't move the same here. After about 2 weeks, we were sitting by the water when an older man walked up to us. He was carrying 2 glass bottles of cold soda, beads of sweat on the outside of them. Without saying much, he handed one to each of us, and then sat down slowly on an overturned bucket like he'd done this 1,000 times before. "Saw you boys out here a few times," he said. "Figured you could use something cold." He told us he'd lived here for decades, said he liked seeing kids hanging around the lake because they bring life back into this town. His face was tanned and weathered, with deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore old work boots and jeans that were stained at the knees, like he still did manual labor even though he had to be in his 70s. At first, I thought he was just being nice. Small towns are supposed to be like that, right? He'd bring sandwiches sometimes, or tell us stories about what this place used to be like. He laughed easily, had that kind of easygoing charm older folks sometimes have when they're used to talking with strangers. He said his uncle used to own this lake, that it used to be private property, but now no one really looked after it. My friend didn't seem fazed by any of it. He acted like it was totally normal for neighbors to bring food and sit with you for a while. He even joked with the guy, called him old man a couple times, and they'd laugh together. It seemed like everyone here knew each other at least a little. Sometimes people jogging by with dogs would wave or stop briefly to ask if we'd caught anything, and then move along. It didn't feel weird at first. The pace of life here was slow, peaceful even. I started getting used to it. The quiet days, the calm lake, and people who didn't mind stopping to talk. The old man kept showing up, always with something: drinks, snacks, stories. Nothing seemed off. He didn't ask weird questions, didn't overstay his welcome. It felt like he was just being part of the community. And honestly, after a while, I started to feel like maybe I could trust this place. One evening, I stayed over at my friend's house. It wasn't anything special. We just hung out late and started talking about plans for the summer. Stuff like biking farther out of town, maybe trying to catch bigger fish, or just finding a better spot by the lake where we wouldn't be bothered. Somewhere in the middle of all that, he mentioned we should finally go visit the old neighbor. You know, he said, he's always saying we should stop by for some of his sweet pie or whatever. He laughed a little, but I just nodded. I smiled too, but something about it didn't sit right. A few days earlier, that same man had been asking me questions that didn't feel like normal small talk. Stuff about my family, where we lived before, even about my dad's job and why we moved here. He said it in a friendly tone, but it was more personal than I liked. I hadn't told anyone about that conversation, and I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I just stayed quiet and nodded like I was down to visit. The next day, I was walking back from the corner store, carrying a bottle of water and some snacks, when I nearly bumped into him. He was standing near the entrance, like he'd been waiting for someone. His face lit up when he saw me. "There you are. Haven't seen you at the lake lately," he said. Then he looked at the bag in my hand. "Didn't know you liked that brand of chips. You always seem to buy them." That caught me off guard. I hadn't talked about snacks with him before. Then he leaned in a little and asked, "You still sleeping near the window in your room? That breeze must be nice at night." I froze. I'd mentioned that to my friend once when we were at the lake. I didn't respond, just kind of forced a smile and mumbled something like, "Yeah, I guess." Then I walked off quickly. My heart was beating too fast, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been listening to more than just casual conversations. It was like I'd accidentally revealed something I wasn't supposed to. After that, I started noticing little things. A few mornings in a row, I found folded pieces of paper left on our front steps. They didn't have names, but I knew they were meant for me. The first one said, "Hope your fishing's been good lately." The next mentioned the specific book I'd been reading, one I only ever took to the lake once. Another one referenced something I'd told my friend about maybe wanting to learn guitar over the summer. What really got me was the fourth note. "That poster on your wall," it said, "reminds me of my youth. Good choice." That one shook me. I hadn't talked about my room with anyone. I kept the blinds closed most of the time. I didn't even know how he could have seen it unless he was close. Too close. I finally brought it up with my friend. At first, he tried to laugh it off, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Then he admitted he'd also gotten a weird vibe a few times. The old man had asked him about his parents' work schedules, and if they were usually home in the evenings. My friend said he thought it was just idle talk. You know how old folks get nosy, but now he wasn't so sure. We didn't feel safe anymore. We decided to tell his parents. We laid it all out. The questions, the notes, the way the man always seemed to know more than he should. They listened quietly, then exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. His dad got up without a word and left the room. A few hours later, we heard he'd contacted local authorities. Turns out, this neighbor wasn't as harmless as he seemed. The police told them that others in the area had raised concerns before, mostly about him being too interested in local kids, but nothing concrete had been done. Our story added weight to the suspicions. Within 2 days, he was gone. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. We heard he packed up and left town. The police didn't say much, just that they were monitoring the situation and to let them know if he came back. After that, I couldn't relax. For the next couple of weeks, every time I stepped outside, I looked around first, phone in hand. People said he left for good, but I didn't feel like it was really over. The lake didn't feel the same. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like something bad still lingered there. Even when I sat out back throwing a ball around or trying to fish by myself, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. What was supposed to be a quiet summer turned into something else. That easygoing life by the lake? Gone. The stories we used to laugh at felt forced now. I kept trying to pretend it was fine, like we could go back to those slow evenings and simple days. But something had changed. Something real. I saw how easy it was for someone to act friendly, to smile, to make you feel safe, while actually pushing into parts of your life they had no business knowing. I didn't forget that. I don't think I ever will. That summer taught me more than I wanted to know about trust, about how close danger can get without you realizing. I stayed close with my parents after that. I told them more, didn't keep stuff inside like I used to. In some strange way, all of it made me more aware, more careful. The world didn't feel so simple anymore, but I knew at least that I could rely on the people who really cared. I've never run so fast in my life as I did that morning, but that's getting ahead of things. It started like any other weekday. I work in an office where the hours can get unpredictable, so I try to stay on top of things by running in the early morning before work. Helps keep me clear-headed. Usually I hit the park just before sunrise, when it's still pretty quiet. I liked having that peace, listening to music, watching the sky change color over the short trees lining the paths. Then I'd head home, grab breakfast, and get on with the day. That particular morning I left a bit later than usual, probably around 6:30 a.m. The park was already a bit livelier by then. I saw a few parents pushing strollers, some older folks doing brisk walks in groups, and a couple of dog walkers. Still felt safe, familiar, nothing strange. I kept to my usual loop, jogging along the main path with my earbuds in, zoning out to some podcast. As I rounded a curve near the park's main entrance, a guy on a bike came up from behind and pulled up beside me. He waved slightly, motioning for me to take my earbuds out. I slowed down a bit and did. He asked, "Do you have the time?" I glanced at my watch and told him, and then he said something about how nice the morning was for a run. Just small talk. He seemed about my age, maybe early 30s, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and black athletic shorts. Seemed normal enough. Then he mentioned there was a better trail, quieter and prettier, not far from where we were, just off the main area. Said he jogged or biked it sometimes when he wanted to get away from the crowds. I didn't really think much of it at first. He sounded friendly, and I'd been running the same loops for months. It was a bit odd that he'd just ride up and offer a suggestion, but it didn't feel pushy. Still, I did feel a little wary. Something about how he seemed too casual, or how he lingered for a second too long. But I shrugged it off. Curiosity got the better of me. I figured it was a public park, broad daylight, and there were other people around. If the path was nice, maybe I could add it to my routine. So I nodded, thanked him for the tip, and jogged in the direction he pointed. He said it was just a couple minutes ahead, then pedaled off the other way. That made me feel a bit more at ease. I thought he was on his way out. As I reached the path entrance, it looked all right. Not sketchy or anything, just a narrower trail through a wooded part of the park. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the trees on either side gave some nice shade. Birds were chirping, and the air felt fresher, more still. A decent change from the more crowded parts. I slowed down a bit, just taking in the calm. It actually felt relaxing, and I started thinking I might have been too suspicious before. The trail curved gently, and I kept jogging, figuring I'd follow it for a bit, then loop back. About 10 minutes in, though, I started noticing how quiet it had gotten. No other runners, no dog walkers. Just silence and the crunch of leaves under my shoes. By now, the sun was fully up, but this section was still dim because of the thick trees overhead. I glanced back down the path, but I couldn't see anyone behind me. I slowed down, just for a second, and remembered all the warnings you hear. Don't run alone in secluded areas. Stick to open paths. Be aware of your surroundings. I wasn't panicking, just more alert. I figured I'd keep going until I reached a spot where the trail ended or reconnected with the main path, then head back. As I came around another bend, that's when I saw him. The same gray t-shirt, standing on the path maybe 20 meters ahead, just standing there, no bike in sight. He wasn't moving, just looking in my direction, not walking, not smiling, just staring. My body went cold, and without even thinking, I sped up, trying to run past him. As I ran past him, I heard him call my name, clear as day. He said it loud, like he wanted to make sure I heard it. I never told him my name. I didn't respond, didn't turn my head, just kept running, trying not to slip on the damp trail. My shoes skidded slightly over the wet leaves, but I kept moving, focused on staying upright. One thought kept repeating in my head. Why is he here if he rode off in the other direction? I pushed harder, breath getting shorter, legs straining. But then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Heavy. Fast. I caught the sound of his breathing, ragged and close. He was chasing me. I veered sharply off the path toward the trees, heading toward a shallow stream I'd glimpsed earlier through the woods. My legs tore through the underbrush, branches slapping against my arms and face. My heart was hammering so hard it hurt, but I forced myself to stay steady. I couldn't afford to panic. I glanced back once, just shadows moving, nothing clear. But I didn't stop. I found some cover behind a cluster of trees and dropped low, hand fumbling for my phone in my pocket. Fingers shaking, I unlocked it and dialed emergency. As soon as I heard the ring, I whispered, "I'm being followed. In the park. Someone's chasing me." The dispatcher came on, calm and steady, asking my location. But I didn't know. The path wasn't marked, and I'd gone off it. "I don't know where exactly," I said, trying to keep my voice down. "Near the stream. Trees. I don't know." I could barely hear her reply over the sound of my own breathing, but she told me to stay on the line and keep moving if I felt unsafe. I didn't respond. I just got up and kept running. I found a narrow path sloping down to a wider stream. There was an old wooden fence, more like a rail, probably meant to keep people from slipping down. I climbed over it, scraping my knee and covering my hands in mud. As I landed on the other side, I heard branches snapping behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted down toward the water, slipping once but catching myself on a tree trunk. Then a yell rang out behind me, loud and angry. He was caught on something, maybe the underbrush or the fence. I didn't wait to find out. I kept running, heart racing, shoes soaked and caked in mud. The trees started thinning out, and I could see the bottom of a hill. At the base, an open area stretched out with a dirt road cutting through. A couple of cars in the distance. My legs were burning, lungs on fire, but I forced myself forward. I stumbled onto the road, flagging down the first vehicle I saw, a small white van parked by the side. An older man stepped out, confused, but when he saw me, covered in dirt, shaking, he didn't hesitate. I told him someone was chasing me and I needed help. He handed me his phone, and I called the police again, giving them the clearest directions I could. The man said he'd drive me somewhere safe, I didn't argue. I climbed into the van, locking the door behind me. We drove a few minutes to a diner just off the road. I sat inside, barely able to drink the water the waitress gave me, while the man stayed close, waiting for the officers. About an hour later, 2 police cars pulled up. The officers took my statement, asked for every detail I could remember. What he looked like, what he said, what direction he might have gone. Then they left to search the area. I stayed behind, numb, tired, completely drained. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to something terrible. If I hadn't trusted my gut when I did, if I'd stopped even once. Later that day, the police called me. They told me that the man I'd described matched someone they were already looking for. Suspect in another district, involved in a few similar cases. Always in parks, always targeting women alone. He hadn't been caught yet, but they believed he would be. He'd left his bike somewhere in the woods, they said. Probably ditched it when he started chasing me. After that, I stopped running alone. I changed everything. Routes, times, habits. Now I only run with friends or in crowded places, never in isolated trails. Every time I pass that park now, even just driving by, I feel this chill go through me. It's hard to explain, but it doesn't go away. What stayed with me the most is how easy it was to fall into the trap. A few friendly words, a calm voice, and you think it's just a normal encounter. But it's not. Not always. I learned that no matter how nice someone seems, no matter how harmless it looks, you can't ignore that small warning bell in your head. That voice that says something's off. Now, I don't stray from the main road. Not in running, not in life. Some risks just aren't worth it. Every month, someone was stealing from my property, but the real turning point came when I trapped 3 of them inside my van and locked the doors with a chain. I live alone in a small house at the edge of town, surrounded by patches of farmland and empty lots. There used to be more people here, my wife, my son, but now it's just me, and this house is all I've got left. It's old but solid, with a detached garage and a weather-beaten shed out back. For years it was quiet. Not much happened except the occasional storm knocking out power, or coyotes sniffing around the fence line. That changed about a year ago. Small things at first. Tools missing, a gas can disappearing, the old lawnmower gone one day. I figured it was kids or someone hard up, but it kept happening. Almost every month, something would vanish from the shed or the garage. I tried locking everything, but they'd cut the locks. I installed 2 cameras, cheap ones from the hardware store, but someone smashed them both within a week. I reported it, but the sheriff didn't have much to go on. No fingerprints, no footage, just broken locks and empty shelves. I talked to the neighbors. They're spread out, nearest one's half a mile down the road, but they'd had the same problem. A stolen generator, a set of tires gone, even a small trailer taken right off the property. We figured it was the same group hitting all of us, but no one had any proof. We were all just getting picked clean, one piece at a time. Then the notes started showing up. First one was left in my mailbox. Just a piece of paper, folded once. "You need to leave," it said. "This land ain't yours." No name, no explanation. I burned it. A week later, another note stuck under my front door. "Get out. Last warning." That one was in red marker, and the letters were shaky, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry or real angry. I took it to the sheriff's office. They said they'd log it, but unless someone actually threatened me face to face, there wasn't much they could do. I started keeping a baseball bat by the door and a loaded shotgun in the bedroom. I barely slept. Every noise outside got me up and looking through the blinds. I could feel them watching the place. Sometimes I'd find boot prints in the dirt near the garage. One morning, the padlock on the shed was cut clean through again, and an old toolbox was gone. That's when I decided I couldn't just sit around waiting for them to take everything. I needed to catch them in the act. I came up with a plan. I had an old cargo van that barely ran, but it looked solid. I parked it right out front, in clear view of the road. Made it look like it had something valuable inside. Covered the windows with blankets from the inside. Left a few boxes visible through the windshield. In reality, the van was empty. I stripped it out completely, removed the passenger seat, cleaned out the back, and installed a heavy chain inside that could lock the rear doors from the outside. I made sure the doors closed tight and couldn't be kicked open once they were shut and secured. That night, I waited in the garage with the door cracked open. From there, I had a clear view of the van and the road. I turned off all the lights inside the house and garage, sat in a chair with the shotgun across my knees and my phone in my hand. The sheriff's number was already pulled up, just in case. Hours passed. Around midnight, I started to think maybe they weren't coming. Then I heard the sound. Soft footsteps on gravel, coming from the far side of the yard. I held my breath and stayed still. 3 figures moved into view, all carrying flashlights, moving slow and quiet toward the van. They didn't talk. One of them walked around the van, checking the doors. Another was looking into the front windshield, trying to see inside. The third one pulled something from his jacket, a crowbar, I think, and started working on the back doors. I watched, heart pounding, gripping the shotgun but not moving. My mouth was dry, and my hands felt like ice. The guy with the crowbar popped the latch, and the doors swung open. They hesitated a second. Then one by one, they climbed into the back of the van. As soon as the last one was inside, I moved fast, ran out of the garage, across the gravel, straight to the van. Before they could react, I slammed the doors shut and looped the chain through the handles, securing the padlock. One of them pounded on the door, yelling. I stepped back, staying out of reach, and called 911. "I've caught them," I said. "They're locked inside my van. I need police here now." The dispatcher told me to stay calm and wait for the patrol car. After a few minutes, the screaming started. First, it was just shouting, angry voices echoing from inside the van, fists pounding against the metal walls. Then came the threats. "You're dead, old man! You're fucking dead!" someone yelled, voice muffled but furious. I didn't move closer, just stood a few steps back, watching the van rock slightly as they threw themselves against the doors. The whole thing felt unreal, like I was outside myself watching this happen. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted the cops to come and catch them in the act. But things kept getting louder, messier. I heard something crash inside the van, like a box, or maybe someone falling. The voices turned on each other, accusations, cursing, shouting. "You said it was clear!" one of them screamed. Another voice responded with what sounded like a punch, followed by more scuffling. They were fighting. Inside that metal box, with no space, no airflow, they were tearing into each other. The temperature had dropped that night, but inside that van it must have felt like an oven with the doors sealed shut. Sweat ran down my back, and I felt sick. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't open the doors. If I did, they'd come straight for me. But leaving them in there, hearing those screams, it didn't feel right either. The noise suddenly stopped. No shouting, no banging, no movement. Just silence, thick and heavy. I stepped a little closer, straining to hear. Nothing. My hand was shaking as I held the phone, watching the road, waiting for headlights. It had only been maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. I didn't know if they were unconscious or just waiting to jump me if I unlocked the van. I stood frozen, staring at the doors, wondering if I had made the worst mistake of my life. When the patrol car finally pulled up, its lights cutting through the dark, I felt a wave of relief, but also dread. 2 officers got out, weapons holstered but hands on their belts. I explained what had happened. Quick, clipped words. One of them told me to unlock the van. I hesitated, then nodded, walking up to the doors and removing the chain. My fingers fumbled with the padlock. It slipped once before I got it off. I couldn't bring myself to look inside, so I stepped back, letting the officer pull open the doors. The smell hit first. Sweat, blood, something else I couldn't place. One officer shined a flashlight inside and swore under his breath. I looked, just for a second. 3 people were crumpled on the floor of the van. 2 of them weren't moving. One was barely breathing, face covered in blood, arms twisted at weird angles. I stumbled backward, hitting the side of the garage, my legs almost giving out. I didn't understand. They'd only been in there a short time. How did it come to this? The officers called for medical. One of them guided me to their car, sat me in the back seat. He didn't cuff me, but he didn't let me go either. They had to ask questions, figure out what happened. I kept repeating the same thing. I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't touch them. I just locked the doors. That's all I did. The ambulance came. Paramedics worked on the guy who was still alive, loaded him up, drove off fast. The other 2, they didn't rush for them. Just covered them up and radioed for someone else to come. I sat in that car, shaking. My mouth felt like sand. The officer said they had to take me in for questioning. Not an arrest, just procedure. But I knew this wasn't going to end with a simple statement. This was bigger than a theft now. People were dead. The van sat there, doors wide open, stained. The house looked different now too, like it didn't belong to me anymore. Like nothing did. The investigation took weeks. I got a lawyer right away. He told me it wasn't clear-cut. I hadn't physically harmed anyone, but I'd set a trap. A deliberate one. The intent was to detain, not injure, but the result was worse. He said it could go either way, charges or no charges, depending on how the DA saw it. I barely heard the rest. Just nodded, signed what I had to, waited. In the end, they didn't press charges. The official report listed the deaths as a result of internal injuries from a fight inside the van. No weapons, just fists and kicks in too tight a space, adrenaline and fear and rage doing the rest. One of them had a heart condition, undiagnosed. The other hit his head against the wall. The third survived, but barely. He was in custody now, awaiting trial on multiple counts of theft and trespassing. They said I was free to go, but nothing about it felt like freedom. I still live in that house. The van's still there too. I haven't moved it. Some nights I wake up sweating, thinking I hear banging on metal, muffled screams. I can't look at the garage without remembering their faces, their voices turning from threats to panic. I don't talk to the neighbors much. They know what happened. Some say I did the right thing. Others don't say anything at all. I don't blame them. I barely know what to think myself. I didn't want this. I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted it to stop. The stealing, the fear, the waiting. But now it's worse. The house feels colder, emptier, like even the memories left. I'm thinking about leaving, selling, moving far away, somewhere with more people, more lights. But no matter where I go, I'll carry it with me. The sound of fists on metal, the silence that followed, the weight of what I did and what I didn't do. Every evening after school, I'd head straight home, toss my backpack in the corner, grab something quick to eat, and then go out to the court behind the school gym. There were a few basketball hoops set up there, and most days me and a couple of friends would play until it got too dark to see the ball. It was routine, nothing special, just a way to pass time and hang out. One day, while we were shooting around and the sun was starting to go down, I noticed a car parked a little ways off, not far from the fence that separated the schoolyard from the street. It wasn't anything fancy, just an older sedan, probably gray or silver. It was hard to tell in the fading light. I didn't think much of it at first. Figured the guy was probably waiting for someone or just parked there for a break. But I kept glancing at it, and after a while, I saw the window roll down. The driver didn't get out or say anything, but I could see his head turn slightly, like he was watching us from inside the car. I caught a glimpse of him resting his elbow on the door, casually looking out. Again, didn't seem too odd. Maybe he was just killing time. The next day, same routine. School, home, snack, then out to the court. We were mid-game, and I glanced toward the street out of habit. The same car was there again, parked in pretty much the same spot. This time I noticed something that made me pause. The driver had the window half down again, but I could see a faint glow from inside. Looked like a phone screen. And the way he was holding it, angled slightly toward us, made it seem like he was either recording or taking photos. I tried to convince myself maybe I was imagining it, but the way he was just sitting there, not moving, just watching, it felt wrong. I didn't say anything at the time. I figured maybe I was reading too much into it. People park near the school all the time. But over the next few days, I started paying more attention. I didn't tell my friends at first, just kept scanning the area when I got there. Some days the car wasn't there, and I'd feel a bit more relaxed. But other days, it'd be right back in the same spot, engine off, windows half down, that same faint screen light glowing inside. 5 or 6 days in, I realized I was scanning the street the moment I stepped onto the court. I couldn't help it. I was looking for that car every time. My friends started noticing. One of them, Mark, even joked about it. Said I was getting paranoid, that maybe I had a secret admirer or something. They all laughed, but I didn't find it funny. No one else seemed to care or even notice the car, but I couldn't shake it. Every time it was there, I saw that same phone, pointed in our direction. Not waving it around, just steady, like someone recording from a distance. I finally decided to get closer, see what I could make out. It wasn't a smart plan or anything. I didn't think it through. Just waited until we had a break in the game and walked a bit off the court, pretending to tie my shoe near the fence. From there, I tried to look into the car without making it too obvious. The guy was middle-aged, maybe late 40s or early 50s, clean-shaven, short hair. He was staring down at his phone, not typing or scrolling, just holding it steady. The window was open just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face, and something about how still he was made my skin crawl. He must have felt me watching because, all of a sudden, he looked up, met my eyes for a second, then started his car without a word. No panic, no rush, just calmly pulled away from the curb and drove off like nothing happened. I didn't say anything to my friends right then. I didn't even finish the game. I just stood there trying to figure out if I was overreacting or if this was something serious. Next day, I couldn't let it go. It didn't feel right keeping it to myself anymore, so I went straight to my basketball coach after school. I told him everything. The coach was a serious guy. He'd been working with kids for years and wasn't the type to brush off even small complaints. After I finished explaining, he asked me to describe the car and the driver in detail. Make, color, anything I remembered. I told him everything I'd seen, including how the man always had a phone pointed our way. The coach nodded, didn't seem surprised or dismissive, just thoughtful. Then he said, "We need to report this to school security and the local patrol." I kind of froze. I didn't expect it to go that far. I asked, "What if it's nothing? I don't want to cause trouble over a misunderstanding." But he didn't let me off easy. "It's better to be safe now than regret it later," he said. "You did the right thing telling me." That settled it. I agreed, and that evening they arranged for a patrol car to be parked near the gym, close enough to see the court, but not so close it would scare anyone off. The school also added more surveillance near the outer fences. When me and a couple friends got to the court, the security guard approached us and quietly said, "Let me know immediately if you spot the vehicle again. Just give a signal." We nodded. At first, nothing happened. We played like usual, tried to stay focused. But after about 20 minutes, I spotted it. The same car, same spot. I quickly nudged my friend and gave the signal to the guard. He got the message and immediately moved to block the street with his own vehicle before the guy could leave. The driver must have noticed something was off because he tried to back up, but the guard cut him off, pulling in front to block the exit. The coach arrived at the same time, walking over to the car calmly but firmly. I stayed behind the fence, watching. I wasn't close enough to hear every word, but I saw how it played out. The driver rolled down his window a bit, looking nervous now, shifting in his seat. The coach asked for ID and wanted to know why he was hanging around school property for days. The man mumbled something about stopping to drink some water, acted confused, like he didn't understand what the fuss was about, but the coach didn't buy it. He glanced inside the car and spotted a camera on the passenger seat with a big lens attached, along with a laptop in the center console. That changed everything. The coach stepped back and told the guard, "You need to call the police now." Then, something else caught the coach's attention. Under the passenger seat, partly visible, was a small backpack, a kid's backpack, colorful with cartoon characters. The man quickly blurted out, "That's not mine. I don't know how that got there." His voice cracked a little, but no one believed him. Moments later, a patrol car arrived, and 2 officers came over, taking control of the situation. They asked for his name, ran it through their system right there. After a few minutes, one of the officers looked up and said, "He's got a record, prior charges for secret video recordings and stalking teenagers." That was it. They cuffed him on the spot. No yelling, no resisting. He just slumped, knowing it was over. Things moved fast after that. The police searched the car thoroughly, took the camera, laptop, and other equipment as evidence. Back at the station, they pulled files from the devices and found hundreds of photos and videos of different schoolyards and playgrounds, not just ours. Some of the files were time-stamped from weeks ago. It wasn't random. He'd been doing this for a while. Word spread fast. Parents in the neighboring district had also reported a suspicious car lurking near their schools. Same description. It wasn't just us. It could have been anyone. When I found that out, I felt sick. We'd been playing basketball just a few meters away from a real threat for days, maybe longer. And if I hadn't noticed, or hadn't said anything, who knows how long it would have gone on. The coach pulled me aside a few days later. "You did the right thing," he said. "A lot of people would have ignored it, but you stayed sharp." I didn't really know what to say, just nodded. It felt strange getting praised for something like that, but deep down, I was glad I spoke up. The school didn't waste any time. Security around the sports courts was increased, and they told all students to be careful, report anything unusual, no matter how small. That whole experience stuck with me. Life was normal, familiar. Then in a few days, everything flipped. Now I know how quickly things can change if you're not paying attention. For a while, I was nervous going out after dark, even for simple stuff like walking to the store. The coach noticed and helped me get back to normal, kept me focused, encouraged me to keep showing up, not to let fear win. I learned something important. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Tell someone. Let them decide if it's serious or not. Waiting and hoping it goes away can be the worst choice. I don't call it paranoia anymore. Sometimes noticing the small things is exactly what keeps people safe. I've been teaching at the university for over 15 years, and by now, I've pretty much seen every kind of student. Some are eager and polite, others more indifferent or even rude, but I usually manage to find a way to get through to most of them. I'm used to the occasional disruption or someone not caring about the material. Comes with the job. But this one student, who showed up at the beginning of the semester, stood out in a way that made even me uneasy. And that's saying something. He was always dressed sharp, like someone who didn't really belong in a regular lecture hall. Expensive watch, designer jacket, never without the latest iPhone in his hand. From the first class, he sat in the back, sprawling out like he owned the place. The way he looked at me, more like through me, was hard to ignore. It wasn't just boredom or distraction. It was contempt, pure and simple. Every time I explained a concept or asked a question to the room, he'd let out these exaggerated yawns, loud enough that other students would turn and glance at him. Sometimes he'd interrupt me, mid-sentence, with a sarcastic comment or a question that was designed to embarrass or mock. "What's the point of this, really? No one's going to use this in the real world," he said once during a discussion about research methodology. He grinned like he was doing everyone a favor by pointing out the truth. I tried not to react, kept it professional, and asked him to see me after class. He came up, leaned against the wall like he was waiting for someone to serve him, and said, "No offense, but I'm here for the credits, nothing else, just a formality." There was something about the way he said that. Like all of us, myself included, were wasting his time. I'd dealt with arrogant students before, ones who thought they knew better or didn't care, but this felt different. He wasn't just detached. He seemed to enjoy showing how little respect he had for the course, the students, and me. I tried to report his behavior, quietly asked the dean's office if they could speak to him or at least note his conduct, but I didn't get much response. It turned out his family had connections, wealth, influence, the kind that makes people in admin tread carefully. It wasn't just me he treated like that either. A few students told me he'd mocked them after class, made jokes about people's appearances, where they were from, even the way they spoke. No one wanted to confront him. He carried himself like someone who was untouchable, like the usual rules didn't apply. Eventually, I stopped engaging with him unless absolutely necessary, hoping he'd get bored and move on. Then, about a month in, he just disappeared. One day he was there, smirking in the back row, and the next, gone. No explanation, no warning. Students whispered about it before and after class. A few said he transferred to a more prestigious program in another city. Others heard he'd dropped out entirely and gone to work for his father's business. I didn't press for details. Honestly, I felt relief. The classroom had this quietness again, like the tension had lifted. Discussions flowed better, no more interruptions, no more cold stares from the back row. But that relief didn't last long. A week or so after he vanished, the dean called me into his office. It wasn't a formal meeting, more like a quiet conversation behind closed doors. He looked serious, not angry, but concerned. He asked me if I'd heard anything about the student, specifically, if I knew anything about an incident or conflict involving him outside of class. I said no, I hadn't, and asked what this was about. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and said there were rumors going around. Nothing official, nothing confirmed, but still troubling. Apparently, There had been an altercation or some kind of situation involving the student and a young woman, another student, who he'd met at one of the campus cafes. There were whispers that he'd harmed her, though the details were vague. No police reports, no formal complaints, just talk. I sat there, trying to process that, and the dean added quickly that he wasn't accusing anyone, just trying to get a sense of what was going on before things escalated. He told me to keep it to myself, not to discuss it with other faculty or students. His exact words were, "We don't want to stir anything up unnecessarily, not until we know for sure." I nodded and left the office, head down, already trying to piece together if this was just gossip or if something worse had happened. A few days later, everything broke into the open. The girl was found in his rented apartment, locked in one of the rooms. She hadn't been able to call for help. Some maintenance worker had entered the place after complaints about noise or something off. It wasn't even the police at first. What they found there shocked everyone. The girl was alive but in a terrible state, both physically and mentally. He was gone. Disappeared without a trace. The whole faculty was shaken. Students whispered in hallways, comparing notes, sharing theories. Some said he had always been unstable, that it was only a matter of time before he snapped. Others admitted they'd seen signs, how he looked at women, how he talked down to people, like nothing and no one mattered. It scared everyone. The idea that someone you sat next to in class could be capable of something like that. Police came to the university. They wanted to talk to people who knew him, anyone who had contact. I was called in for questioning. I told them everything I had noticed. His behavior in class, the arrogance, the way he challenged authority. I admitted I had spoken to the dean's office about him weeks earlier, but never imagined something this serious. They asked if he had ever made specific threats. He hadn't. Not direct ones. But there were things he said, comments about people being weak, about how the rules didn't apply to him. At the time, it sounded like typical rich kid nonsense. Now, I wasn't so sure. I kept thinking back to one lecture where he said, "Some people are just here to be used. That's life." I had dismissed it as a crude joke then. Now, it felt different. Like a window into what he really thought. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the first time he had crossed a line, and it wouldn't be the last. He acted like consequences didn't exist for him, and maybe they didn't. That was what truly disturbed me. When they finally located him, it was in another city. He had managed to get lawyers involved before the police even reached him. Top-tier defense team, the kind only someone with serious money could afford. He was calm, confident, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Everything that happened was consensual, he told the press, standing beside his lawyers. The girl, meanwhile, could barely speak in public, still under psychiatric care. But she was brave. She gave her statement, repeated what had been done to her. Evidence was clear. Her belongings in his apartment, locks on the door, physical injuries, trauma. At first, it looked like the case would be open and shut. But slowly, things started to shift. Reports stopped mentioning some of the more damning evidence. Witness statements were inconclusive. The media softened the story, calling it a dispute rather than a crime. Influential people began to surface. Family friends, business associates. Suddenly, there was talk that the case was complicated, that jurisdictional issues made prosecution tricky. Something about international status and diplomatic protections. I went to the hearings, sat quietly behind the rows of lawyers, trying to support the girl. But her voice kept getting lost under legal documents and bureaucratic talk. Every time she spoke, it felt like it didn't matter. She was up against a machine. The final blow came when a judge declared that due to certain international agreements, he couldn't be tried here. The exact legal language was confusing, but the result was clear. He wouldn't face real punishment. His lawyers called it a win for justice. I watched him walk out of the courtroom, untouched, smug as ever. I didn't even know what to feel anymore. Rage, helplessness. It all blended into something numb. He left the country soon after. Just disappeared again. No statements, no apology, no accountability. The case faded from public view. The girl, her life shattered, was left to pick up the pieces alone. The university made it clear they wanted to move on. I was told, politely but firmly, to avoid discussing it further. "It's not good for the school's reputation," someone said to me in a meeting. Since then, my classroom has changed. There's a silence that wasn't there before. Students don't talk about certain things. They've learned that speaking up doesn't always matter, that sometimes power wins. I try to mention respect and safety in lectures now, to encourage them to value each other. Maybe someone will listen, maybe it will help. But I can't forget what happened. It's always there, under the surface. The knowledge that someone like him can walk away, untouched, while others live with the damage forever. Sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare where nothing makes sense and wrong goes unpunished. I don't know if I'll ever stop blaming myself for not acting sooner, for not doing more. All I can do now is hope that this story reaches someone who will choose to act differently, someone who won't stay silent. My daily routine was so repetitive that I stopped noticing anything around me. I lived in a small rented apartment, woke up to the hum of the air conditioner, washed up, and left for work around dawn. Every morning was the same. I walked through several blocks with neat houses and well-kept front gardens, then turned toward a 2-story building where my office was. The neighborhood was quiet at that time, with just a few people heading to nearby cafes to grab their takeout coffee. Sometimes I'd nod at familiar faces, neighbors I didn't know by name, but saw often enough to recognize. One morning, while passing the usual route, I noticed a man standing near a brick building that looked like a private clinic. At first, I thought he was waiting for someone, or maybe collecting donations. He was holding a sign, and I didn't pay much attention. But as I got closer, I heard short, sharp phrases coming from him. It didn't sound like someone asking for help or trying to raise awareness. The words were aggressive, almost like he was scolding someone, though no one was with him. I walked a little faster, trying not to make eye contact, and didn't look back. The next day, he was there again, in the exact same spot. Every morning after that, the man was standing by the same clinic wall, shouting phrases I couldn't fully understand at first. But slowly, I started picking up parts of what he was saying. He was calling people sinners and guilty. It seemed like he was judging everyone who walked past or went in and out of the building. His voice was loud, but not panicked. More like someone giving a speech with anger behind it. I felt uncomfortable every time I passed by, but I told myself to ignore it. I didn't want to engage. Most people walking by seemed to do the same. Heads down, fast pace, avoid the guy. After about a week, his presence became a part of my routine, something unpleasant but expected. His shouting was still disturbing, but I had gotten used to hearing his voice echoing off the walls. Sometimes, I could feel his eyes following me as I passed, like he was waiting for me to stop or react. There was something in the way he looked, like he was blaming me for something I didn't do. Still, I kept walking, never meeting his gaze. No one argued with him. It was like people either didn't want to get involved or were afraid of what he might do. I started to think maybe he wasn't all there mentally, like he was dealing with something serious in his own head. But one morning, I noticed he wasn't just shouting anymore. He started targeting specific people. The moment someone stepped toward the clinic, he would lunge a few steps forward and yell things that sounded threatening. I saw it happen with a young woman. She came out of the clinic with tears in her eyes, clearly shaken, and he followed her down the sidewalk, shouting at her, calling her disgusting names, accusing her of things I couldn't even fully hear. She picked up her pace, almost running, and he kept after her for maybe 10 or 15 meters before turning back to his spot. It didn't feel random anymore. It looked like he was deliberately trying to scare everyone who had anything to do with that clinic. Something about the way he moved, like he was just barely holding himself back, made my stomach twist. I didn't know what kind of services that clinic offered, and honestly, I didn't care. But seeing him chase that woman was the moment I realized it wasn't just some harmless weirdo yelling at the sky. It was intimidation, plain and simple. I hoped someone had already called the police, but that evening I went ahead and did it myself. I didn't want to give my name, so I just left an anonymous message with the local public order office. Next morning, I actually saw 2 officers talking to him. They didn't seem aggressive, just calm, maybe even a little tired. They stayed for about 10 minutes, then got back in their car and drove off. The man returned to his spot, holding his sign, acting like nothing had happened. I guess technically, he wasn't breaking any laws. He stood on the public sidewalk and didn't touch anyone. Still, it didn't feel right. A few more days passed, and his behavior got worse. He started shouting louder, with this raw, angry voice that made you stop and look whether you wanted to or not. He brought homemade signs now, big ones with threats scrawled in marker, stuff that was hard to ignore. He was also stepping closer to people, too close. You could see folks getting uncomfortable, trying to avoid him, speeding up or crossing the street just to not walk near him. I heard someone from the neighborhood association was filing complaints, saying this wasn't peaceful protest anymore. It was harassment. I believed it. I was so uneasy walking past him that I began taking a longer route to work, looping around a couple of extra blocks. It added 10 minutes to my morning, but it felt worth it. Then came Friday. I was running late and didn't have time for the detour, so I went my usual way, telling myself I'd just walk fast and ignore him like before. But that day, as I got near, he turned and walked straight at me. There was no one else nearby. He came right up, inches away from my face, eyes locked on mine, and started shouting. I couldn't even process the words at first, something about filth and punishment. But his tone, his body language, everything was aggressive. I froze. My legs didn't move, and I felt this weird pause, like something bad was about to happen. His shoulders tensed, his hands clenched, and I thought, this guy's about to grab me or hit me. Then, just as he took a step closer, a security guard from the clinic rushed out and yelled at him. That broke the moment. I took a quick step back, then another, and the guy didn't follow. He stood there glaring, but he didn't move again. I didn't wait. I turned and walked away fast, not running, but not slow either. The very next day, I heard that he had finally been arrested. Apparently, he'd tried to grab a nurse outside the clinic's entrance. This time, people had seen it, and police didn't just talk to him. They took him in. Everyone in the area seemed relieved. For weeks, we'd all been living with this tension, this constant stress of not knowing when he'd go too far. The local news ran a small piece about it. They said he followed some extreme ideology, believed he was some kind of righteous figure who had to fight against the people using and working in that clinic. He thought his actions were justified, even necessary. That hit me hard. How far someone could go, convinced they were right. I always thought I lived in a quiet, safe place, where no one would cross the line like that. Turns out, even the calmest street can hide something dangerous, something that can snap and become real, physical, unpredictable. Since then, I always check my surroundings in the morning. I take nothing for granted. There's always a little tension now, a low buzz of awareness I can't shut off. I was just a regular college student trying to make some cash during summer break. Nothing fancy, just looking for something simple that wouldn't wear me out. That's how I ended up taking a job as an evening security guard at a high-end apartment complex with a pool. The hours were decent, 6 p.m. to midnight, and honestly, it seemed like the easiest gig I could get. Sit around, make sure no one runs on wet tiles, keep the noise down, and maybe tell a kid or two not to jump off the diving board sideways. The pay was all right, especially for the amount of effort I was putting in. The first few nights were exactly what I expected. Families with kids showed up after dinner. Some parents swam with their little ones. Others just lounged nearby, scrolling their phones. Couples would stretch out on the lounge chairs, sipping drinks, talking quietly. The place had this relaxed vibe. Nothing really required my attention except for the occasional loud splash, or a group of teenagers getting too rowdy. I'd walk around every now and then, make sure no glass bottles were near the pool, check the filters, basic stuff. Easy work, and I was starting to think I'd struck gold with this job. But then, on my third night, I noticed something. A man I hadn't seen before was sitting alone on a bench at the far end of the pool area. No swim trunks, no towel, not even sandals. Just regular clothes, like he'd come from inside his apartment and didn't plan to swim. He sat really still, hands resting on his knees, and kept his eyes fixed on the water. Not looking around, not on his phone, just staring at the pool. I figured maybe he was just taking a break or thinking about something. People do that sometimes. I didn't think much of it. Then I saw him again. Same spot, same time. Still just watching. His face didn't show anything. No smile, no frown, just blank. Like he wasn't really present. What caught my attention more was how his eyes seemed to track people in the pool, especially the kids. There was this one girl, probably around 6 or 7, learning to swim with a group of other kids and an instructor. At least twice that night, I caught him watching her specifically, his head tilting slightly when she moved to a different part of the pool. It wasn't obvious, not like he was leering or doing anything that'd immediately raise alarms, but it felt off. I made a note about it in the little incident log I had to keep. Just a small line. Man sitting alone, seemed focused on child swim group, but I didn't dwell on it. I thought, maybe he's just lonely, watching people have fun. He started coming every night after that, without fail, exactly at the same time, around 7:15 p.m. He would walk straight to the same bench, sit down, and fix his gaze on the water. He never spoke to anyone, not once. Even when people passed close by or greeted him out of politeness, he didn't reply. Just nodded sometimes, barely acknowledging them. He didn't smile, didn't swim, didn't even dip his feet in. He just sat and watched. When most families started to pack up and leave, he stayed. Sometimes he would sit for an extra hour after the place had mostly emptied out, just sitting there in the fading light, his drink in hand. After a few more nights of this, I finally asked the front office about him. The response I got was pretty dismissive. "Oh yeah, that's Mr. Geller," the receptionist said. "He's a full-time resident, pays for all amenities, kinda keeps to himself, but he's harmless." When I brought up how he didn't swim or interact, they waved it off. "He has the right to be there if he wants. Don't hassle him." It didn't sit right with me, though. I wasn't trying to hassle anyone, but this guy didn't behave like someone just enjoying the pool area. He started bringing a drink with him, some kind of bottled soda or juice, I think. He'd open it, take a sip now and then, and just sit. His eyes never left the pool. More than once I saw him scan the people arriving, like he was looking for someone specific. And whenever that same little girl came with her parents, I noticed his body shift slightly, as if becoming more alert. He would lean forward just a little, grip the bottle tighter. Again, nothing that could technically count as a violation, but enough to make me uneasy. I waited a few more days, thinking maybe I was overreacting. But the pattern kept repeating. Same time, same bench, same routine. Finally, I decided I had to say something more serious. I went to the property manager, told him exactly what I'd noticed, and mentioned how the guy seemed particularly focused on this one child. I tried to keep it factual, didn't accuse the guy of anything, just said it was unusual behavior that I thought someone should be aware of. The manager just shook his head and gave this tired look. He's alone, moved in recently, probably just adjusting. Watching families might help him feel less isolated. Can't go accusing someone just because they're quiet. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't make trouble where there is none. It's not a good look." Then he got up and walked out of the office, leaving me standing there. One evening, the girl who'd caught the man's attention was packing up with her parents when she suddenly ran back toward the pool. I was doing a quick walk around when I noticed her kneeling by a chair, searching for something. Then she looked toward the bench where the man always sat, and sure enough, he was there again, holding something in his hand. As she got closer, I realized it was her swimming goggles. He held them out to her, smiling. Not a friendly smile, but something stiff, unnatural. The girl hesitated, standing just a few feet away. Then, instead of taking them, she stepped back quickly, almost stumbling, clearly unsure. I moved toward them fast, trying to stay calm. "Everything all right over here?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. The man looked up at me with this cold stare, not angry, just blank like before. But now there was something else, like he was annoyed I'd interrupted. His eyes narrowed, and without a word, he handed the goggles to the girl and turned toward the locker rooms. I stood there watching him until he disappeared through the door. Something about the way he walked off, not hurried, not relaxed, just calculated. I stayed near the girl for a minute until her parents noticed her and called her back. She ran to them, goggles in hand, and I waited until they left together. Then I made another round of the pool area, checking behind the chairs, near the showers, anywhere someone might be hiding. Nothing seemed out of place, but my gut wouldn't settle. 10 minutes later, I went straight to the admin office, told them exactly what happened. The girl, the goggles, the man's reaction. The manager just sighed, rubbing his forehead. "He didn't do anything wrong," he said again. "Let's not overthink this." That night, I couldn't sleep. My head kept spinning with worst-case scenarios. I felt like I was missing something huge, and no one wanted to see it. A few days passed with no sign of him, and I thought maybe he'd moved out or got bored of watching the pool. Then one evening, right before closing time, everything changed. The girl didn't come back from the pool with her parents. They searched the whole area, calling her name, panic rising fast. I heard shouting and ran over, saw the mother crying, the father dialing someone frantically. Within half an hour, police were on site, tape went up, and they started asking questions. They called in all the staff for statements. When it was my turn, I told them everything. About the man, his habits, the way he watched the girl. They asked where he usually sat, what he looked like, if I'd written anything down. I showed them the incident log, the entry I'd made weeks ago. Suddenly the staff who'd shrugged him off were scrambling to remember who he was, where he lived, what his name was. That's when it got worse. Turned out, the guy had rented an apartment using fake documents. The lease file had a name, but when police checked, no record of that person existed. Security footage from the pool area showed him leaving at different times over the weeks, always blending into the crowd. Sometimes he'd leave with a drink in hand, sometimes with nothing. But what stood out was how often he managed to walk out of frame right before cameras caught a full shot of him. It was like he knew exactly where the blind spots were. The more I heard, the colder I felt. This wasn't some lonely guy watching families. This was something else entirely. Police expanded the search, going door to door in the surrounding area. They checked nearby motels, parks, abandoned buildings. Everyone at the complex was on edge, and every parent kept their kids inside. I kept thinking about how many nights I'd seen him, how often I'd felt something was wrong, and how nobody listened. Not even me, really. I could have pushed harder. About a week later, the police found her. Alive. She'd been locked in a room inside a house about 30 miles outside the city. Neighbors reported seeing someone suspicious moving in a few days before, but no one paid attention until they saw the missing girl's photo on the news. When the cops got there, the place was empty. He'd bailed, left behind clothes, food wrappers, and the girl. She was scared, dehydrated, but safe. Her parents couldn't stop thanking the officers, but the looks on their faces, it was like something in them broke and wouldn't heal. The thing that stuck with me was how close it had come to ending differently. If he hadn't panicked and run, if the neighbors hadn't called, if the police hadn't acted fast. And I kept thinking, what if someone had done something sooner? What if I'd forced the issue weeks ago? That guilt doesn't go away. The manager apologized to me quietly one night, said they should have taken it more seriously. But that didn't change what almost happened. I quit that job the next day, sent in my resignation, and didn't look back. What I thought would be an easy summer gig turned into the worst stretch of my life. I still think about that girl sometimes, about what could have happened. I'm glad she made it out. But I keep replaying every moment, every time I saw that man, every time I walked past him and said nothing. The way people ignored warning signs until it was almost too late. It's what haunts me most. I started getting anonymous letters with exact lines from my private phone calls. Things I'd only ever said to one or two people, and never out loud in my house. A few weeks earlier, I'd moved into a small house on the edge of a quiet region, hoping to restart my life after a messy breakup and a stressful job. The area was peaceful, mostly retired folks, some families with kids. My house wasn't fancy, but it had a neat garden, a low white fence, and a big living room with wide windows that looked out at the hills. The first few days felt almost like a vacation. No city noise, no constant car horns or sirens, just wind through the trees and the occasional dog barking. I'd drink my coffee on the back porch and hear nothing but birds. I was glad not to hear neighbors arguing or kids screaming in the hallway like in my old apartment. It stayed quiet for about a week. Then, one afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no name, just my address written in neat block letters. Inside was a small piece of paper with a short sentence, something I had said to a friend on the phone just 2 days earlier. It wasn't anything crazy, just me talking about how I hated my old job and how I'd never go back to that life. But the wording was exactly what I'd said. I remember pausing in the kitchen, just staring at it, trying to figure out if someone I knew was playing a joke. Maybe I'd told someone else and they thought it'd be funny to mess with me. But I hadn't told anyone else, just one call, and I hadn't recorded it. I tossed it in the trash and told myself it was probably some mix-up. A few days later, another envelope came. Same thing. No name, no address, just a typed note this time with another line I'd said over the phone. This one was more personal. Me talking about my ex, and how I hoped I'd never run into him again. Again, exactly word for word. It felt different now. Not a joke, not a mistake. Someone had to be listening. Still, I didn't want to overreact. Maybe someone nearby had overheard me if I'd been speaking outside or something. Maybe my phone had some glitch. I tried to find some reasonable explanation and told myself to stay calm. But the next letter shook me more. This one wasn't just about something I'd said recently. It mentioned the name of a childhood friend I hadn't spoken to in years and a detail about my family, a fight between my uncle and father that had never been discussed in public. That wasn't from a recent call. That was from my past. Whoever was writing these knew way too much, and I was sure now they were watching me somehow. I started checking my windows more often, looking for signs of someone outside. But nothing ever looked out of place. I didn't tell anyone about the letters at first. I thought maybe if I ignored it, it would stop. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But at night, I kept thinking about how they could have gotten that info. Was my phone bugged? Was there some device in my house? I tried to act normal, hoping it was just some twisted prank. Meanwhile, I kept working on setting up the house. I replaced the old curtains with thicker ones, rearranged some of the furniture to make it more functional, and started checking all the wiring since the lights flickered sometimes. One day, I was in the attic, tracing some old cables to see if any were frayed or dangerous. It was dusty up there, full of cobwebs, but I didn't mind. I found a long black wire running along the beam, but instead of going down into the wall, it disappeared into one of the air vents. It didn't look like a normal electrical wire. It was thinner, like something for audio equipment. I followed it as far as I could, but the vent opening was too small to see inside. I figured maybe it was just some leftover setup from the previous owner, maybe a security system or speaker line they'd forgotten to pull out. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was more focused on getting the attic cleaned and checking for any fire hazards. But then more letters arrived, and they got worse. These ones didn't just mention old details. They quoted full conversations I'd had at night, when I was sure no one else could hear. I'd talked to my sister around midnight one evening, venting about some stuff I didn't want to share with anyone else. The next morning, there was a letter quoting my exact words from that call. I hadn't even been near a window. That's when I started to feel real fear, not just unease, but like someone was in my space, inside my home without me knowing. I finally went to the local police station. I showed them the letters, explained the situation, told them about the wire in the attic, and how it felt like someone was tapping into my phone or listening in somehow. They listened politely, but said, unless I had proof of a break-in or a known suspect, there wasn't much they could do. Install a security system, the officer said. Keep a log of anything suspicious. That was it. I left feeling stupid. Like maybe they thought I was just imagining things. But I wasn't. The letters were real. The wire was real. Someone was messing with me, and they were getting more invasive. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the house felt louder. I checked all the vents again, trying to trace that wire further, but it just disappeared into the walls. The breaking point came when I opened an envelope and found printed photos of my adult son. He lives in another state, doesn't share much online, and we hadn't seen each other in months. These weren't pictures from social media. They were recent, candid, taken at his job or near his apartment. That's when I knew this wasn't a prank or someone with old information. Whoever was doing this had followed him. They were crossing a line I didn't even know existed. I packed up every letter, every envelope, and started checking the house inch by inch. I didn't sleep. I moved furniture, tapped on walls, opened up vents. The attic became my main focus. I'd already found that wire, so I figured something else had to be there. I shifted old boxes, most empty, until I found one that felt heavier than it looked. Inside was a mess of tangled wires, some broken microphones, and a strange device. Small, square, with switches and a short antenna. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't look like anything standard. I called a local electrician I'd used before. He came the next day, and when I showed him the box and the wires, his face tightened. He said the equipment looked old but functional, likely used to record or transmit audio. He pointed out some connections that ran through the attic and down into the walls, and explained that it wouldn't be hard to install small mics throughout the house using this setup. He didn't want to say more, but I could tell he was disturbed. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The house wasn't just old, it was rigged, wired up like some surveillance post. Someone had been listening. Maybe still was. I called the police again, demanded they search the entire place, said I didn't feel safe and there was proof someone had violated my privacy. They took me more seriously this time. 2 officers came out, looked at the attic, examined the device. One of them said they'd had reports about the previous owner being eccentric, but didn't give details. They agreed to do a full sweep. That's when they found it. Behind a door I hadn't really used, a small storage room near the back of the house. There was a loose panel in the floor. Beneath it, a narrow crawl space that led down to what looked like a sealed-off basement. It wasn't on any of the house plans. The officers went down first, and I stayed back, heart pounding. About 10 minutes later, they called me down to show what they'd found. The crawl space ended in a small concrete room under the garage. It smelled of damp earth and mold, and the walls were lined with shelves full of junk. Old tools, wires, batteries, cans of food. But the floor told a different story. In the dust were fresh footprints, clear as day. Someone had been there recently. The officers said the door to the outside had been used. It led to the side of the garage, hidden behind some overgrown bushes. They took photos, gathered some evidence, and told me whoever had been squatting there had probably been using the space as a hideout. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The idea that someone had been moving beneath my house, listening, watching, maybe even slipping in while I was away, it made my skin crawl. The officers returned the next day with more information. The house had once belonged to a retired military guy, someone with mental health issues who'd been evicted years ago after failing to pay taxes. But there were rumors he never really left, that he'd stayed close, believing the house was still his. They wouldn't confirm it, but I had a bad feeling he was the one behind the letters. I started imagining him nearby, hiding in the woods, peering through my windows, sending those letters after listening to every word I said. Maybe he saw himself as the guardian of the house, and I was the intruder. I began to feel like the walls had eyes, like every move I made was being tracked. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stage, and I didn't know who was in the audience. Then, one night, it all came to a head. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise outside, soft rustling near the garage. I didn't wait. I called the police, told them someone was outside, that I was sure it was him. They arrived within minutes, silent and quick, flashlights cutting through the dark. They caught him hiding behind the garage, crouched in the weeds with a small bag and some tools. He didn't resist, just stood there, hands up, muttering something about protecting the house and keeping it safe. One of the officers opened the bag and found a notebook filled with scribbles. My name, dates, things I'd said. Pages filled with logs of my daily routine, times I'd made phone calls, what I'd cooked for dinner. I stood there, frozen, while they led him away. He kept repeating, "I've been helping her. She doesn't understand. They want the house, not her." His face was blank, but his voice was calm, almost gentle, like he believed it, like he thought he was the hero of the story. They confirmed later that he was the previous owner, the one who'd been evicted years ago, He'd been living nearby, sneaking into the crawl space, using the old surveillance system he'd installed when he lived there. All the wires, the letters, the recordings, they were his. He'd never let go of the house. After they took him, I walked through the rooms, looking at the walls like they were strangers. I couldn't feel safe. Every sound made me jump. I unplugged everything, stopped using my phone at home. I felt like I was still being watched, even though I knew he was gone. The police suggested I move, said the history of the house might be too much to get past. They were right. I'm planning to leave, find somewhere new. But I know it'll be a long time before I feel normal again. The thought of those letters, the photos, his voice in the wires, I can't shake it. That house might have looked peaceful from the outside, but inside, it was never really mine. It's still hard to believe this happened, but I guess things always seem normal until they're not. The strangest part? It all started with something as simple as a math assignment. I go to a small high school, not tiny, but small enough that when someone new shows up, everyone notices. There's just not much that goes unnoticed in our class. Right before winter hit, this new guy joined us. He was quiet, polite, and seemed kind of shy, which made people curious. But he wasn't awkward about it. He didn't push to talk to anyone or make a show of trying to fit in. He mostly kept to himself. Then, totally unexpected, one day he sat down next to me and asked if I wanted help with our algebra homework. I'm not gonna lie, I thought it was kind of random. We weren't friends, hadn't even really talked. But math's not my strong suit, and he seemed to know what he was doing, so I figured, why not? He wasn't pushy or anything, just said he noticed I was stuck on a couple of problems and offered to walk me through them. He was good at it too, patient, explained things clearly, didn't act like he was better than me. After that, we started working together more often. Not just in math, sometimes in other classes too. He even started giving me part of his lunch if I didn't have enough money for food, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. It didn't feel weird at the time, just seemed like something a good guy would do. We started sitting together during breaks, and I thought, hey, maybe I finally have a solid friend. He had this dry kind of humor, not laugh out loud funny, but he made weird jokes sometimes that actually cracked me up. My parents even commented on it, how it was nice to see me hanging out with someone so respectful and smart. Things were smooth. He wasn't the life of the party or anything, but slowly, the rest of the class started warming up to him too. Teachers liked him because he did his work and didn't cause trouble. It all seemed pretty normal, like your average new kid gets used to school story. I never thought twice about anything being off. One Friday, he asked if I wanted to come over after school. Said he got a new board game and wanted to try it out with someone. I didn't really like going to people's houses, especially not without a heads up, but I didn't want to be rude, and I figured, it's just for a couple of hours. So I said yeah. His place was about 15 minutes from mine, but it was in this area past the main blocks, near this big empty lot. Not exactly the nicest part of town, not dangerous, just kind of run down. His house looked older than most, with faded paint and a chain-link fence around the yard. I remember the front door squeaked loud when he opened it, and inside, it smelled like old furniture and something I couldn't place. His parents were there, but they didn't say much. His dad barely looked at me and just nodded when we came in. His mom smiled, but it was this stiff kind of smile, like she was forcing it. She glanced at us, then at the hallway behind us, almost like she was watching to make sure we didn't go somewhere we weren't supposed to. I figured maybe they were just private people. Not everyone's outgoing. We went to his room, which was upstairs at the end of the hall. It was neat, kind of plain. Bed, desk, a shelf with books and games. He put on some music, real low, just background noise, and pulled out the board game. We played a couple rounds, nothing fancy, just passing time. But I noticed something weird. He locked the door as soon as we got inside. Not just closed it, locked it. I didn't ask why, didn't want to make it awkward, but I thought it was strange. He didn't mention it either, just acted like it was normal. The lock clicked, and that was it. A couple of times while we were playing, I heard footsteps in the hall. Light ones, maybe his mom or dad. Once, there was a sound like someone tried the door handle, but he didn't react, just kept playing like he didn't notice. I glanced at the door, but he acted like everything was fine. I didn't say anything. After a while, I told him I had to head home. It was getting dark early with winter coming, and I didn't want to be out too late. He walked me to the door, and just as I was about to leave, his dad appeared at the front hallway. First time he'd spoken since I arrived. He looked right at me and said, real serious, "Don't go poking around in the pantry. Stay out of the storage room." I was confused. I hadn't even seen a pantry or storage room. I didn't even know where it was. I just nodded, said okay, and stepped outside. The door shut behind me with a loud snap. As I walked back, I kept thinking about how he locked the door, how his mom watched us like a hawk, and why his dad gave me that warning when I never even got near any other room. I didn't run home or anything, just walked steady. But the whole time I felt like someone was watching me from behind a curtain. A couple weeks passed, and I started noticing some changes in him. At first, it was little things. He didn't sit with me anymore, didn't offer help with homework, barely even said hi. If I asked something, he just shrugged or gave short answers, like he couldn't be bothered. His mood was off. He seemed tense, easily irritated, like something was eating at him. He avoided eye contact and kept looking over his shoulder, like he was watching for someone. Then he started bringing this massive backpack to school. Before, he used to just carry a small one, barely enough for a couple notebooks. Now he had this big, heavy-duty bag, the kind you take on camping trips. At first, I figured maybe he was carrying sports stuff or extra books, but it looked overstuffed, like it was packed to the limit every day. He never let it out of his sight. Not in class, not in the cafeteria, nowhere. He even took it with him to the bathroom once, which caught my attention. One day at lunch, we were walking down the hall toward the cafeteria, and I noticed the zipper on his bag had come a bit undone. Something inside caught the light, a quick, metallic flash. I looked closer, and I swear it was a blade. Not just a pocket knife. This thing was big. The handle looked like it belonged to a kitchen knife, maybe even bigger. My legs just stopped moving and I stood there staring. He must have caught me looking because he quickly turned, yanked the zipper shut, and pulled the bag closer. He didn't say anything, didn't even make a joke, just tightened the straps on his shoulders and kept walking like nothing happened. I stood there for a second, completely frozen, my heart racing. There was no reason for him to have something like that at school. None. I wanted to ask him about it, but when I caught up, he didn't give me a chance. He veered off down a different hallway, didn't even glance back. That's when it really hit me that something was wrong. Not just a bad mood or family issues, this felt different, dangerous. The next day, he wasn't in class. At first, everyone thought he was just sick or maybe skipped. But around lunchtime, some of the guys in our class were messing around near his locker and noticed something strange. His locker was locked like always, but someone had jammed a small notebook between the door and the frame. It looked like it had been shoved in there quickly, maybe meant to be hidden, but part of it was sticking out. I don't know what got into me, maybe just the tension from the day before, but I pulled it out and flipped it open. The pages were filled with notes, handwritten, messy, all over the place. It wasn't normal class stuff. It was detailed plans. There were lists of names, including people from our class, teachers, even the principal. Routes drawn in blue pen, showing different paths through the school. Timings noted down, like when certain hallways would be empty. We gathered around, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw my own name in one of the notes. Next to it, he'd written something like, "X supports me, might go with me." I felt sick. I wasn't part of anything. I had no idea what he was planning, but to him, I was somehow on his side. My hands started shaking. The others didn't say anything, just stared at me, waiting to see what I'd do. I knew we couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the notebook and went straight to the teacher's office. We explained everything, how we found it, what was inside. The teachers looked shocked at first, then serious. One of them took the notebook, and we were told to stay put. Within an hour, the police were there. I had to tell them everything, from the moment I met him to what I saw in his backpack the day before. After that, things moved fast. They found him later that day, at his house. Didn't say where exactly, but the officers told us he was being taken in for evaluation. They said he wasn't coming back to school anytime soon. Then more stuff came out. Turned out he had a record back in his old city. There were reports of him being aggressive, even violent. His parents had moved to our town to start fresh, hoping things would settle down. But they hadn't. He hadn't changed. He just waited, planning something in silence while everyone thought he was the quiet, helpful new kid. The scary part? Nobody saw it coming. Not the teachers, not the students, not even me. And I was the one he spent the most time with. I had to talk to the police a few times after that, explain I didn't know about his plans, didn't agree to anything. They believed me, but the whole thing left a mark. My parents were shaken. My mom kept saying, "You never really know people." And she was right. I thought I had a friend, but he was using me. Using the idea of having a friend as cover for whatever he was planning. Sometimes I still think about what could have happened if we hadn't found that notebook, if his bag hadn't opened. It's hard to shake. I don't really trust people the same way anymore. Even when someone seems nice, I take a step back. You never really know what someone's carrying with them, literally or in their head. I live alone in a 2-story house that I inherited from my parents. It's not huge, but it's more than enough space for me. The thing is, money's tight sometimes, and keeping up with bills and repairs on just my salary was getting to be too much. So about 6 months ago, I decided to rent out the second bedroom. Long-term only, no short stays. I wanted someone stable. I used one of the big rental websites, made a profile, uploaded a few decent pictures of the room, listed the rent, and added some house rules. No parties, no loud music, and shared chores. A few days later, I got a message from a guy named Andre. He was polite, wrote well, and didn't seem pushy. His profile had positive reviews from other hosts, and he sent over scanned copies of his ID and a reference letter from a former landlord. Everything checked out, and he seemed like a safe bet. We set up a time for him to come see the place, and when he arrived, he looked clean, well-dressed, normal. Young guy, maybe late 20s, carrying just a backpack and a small suitcase. He spoke calmly, asked reasonable questions, and didn't try to haggle over rent. I figured, okay, this might actually work out. The first few days were fine. He kept to himself mostly, but he'd always say hello when he saw me. He left for work early, around 7 a.m., and usually came back around 6 or 7 in the evening. Sometimes he'd stop by the store on the way home and bring groceries. He'd knock on my door and ask if I needed anything before he went shopping. It felt thoughtful, and I appreciated the gesture. He was tidy in the kitchen, always cleaned up after himself, and never left dishes in the sink. I thought finally, I got lucky with a tenant who's actually considerate. But after about 3 weeks, I started feeling off. Nothing I could put my finger on exactly, just strange, like someone was paying attention to me too closely. I would walk into the bathroom and feel like the air had shifted, like someone had been in there longer than just for a quick shower or to brush their teeth. Once I walked into my bedroom and had this gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place, but it didn't feel right. It felt like someone had been in there, even though I always kept the door shut when I wasn't inside. Still, I couldn't prove anything, and I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Andre never entered any space without knocking. He was always polite, even a little reserved. There was no reason to think he'd do anything weird. He didn't give off any creepy vibes directly. But the feeling kept coming back, stronger each time. Something about his presence in the house made me uneasy, and I couldn't shake it. One night we were both in the kitchen. I was making tea, and he was preparing something simple, like a sandwich. We started talking, just casual stuff at first. Then out of nowhere he asked, "So, do you live here completely alone?" I nodded, said yes, and kept stirring my tea. Then he asked if I had ever been married. I told him briefly that I had, but it ended a while ago. He nodded and asked if I had any close family nearby. I didn't like where the questions were going, but I just said no. My family was in another city. I thought maybe he was just being friendly, trying to get to know me. Then he asked, "Do you work from home or are you usually out during the day?" I paused for a second before saying I worked part-time outside the house. He smiled, said something like, "Ah, must be nice to have a flexible schedule." I didn't say anything back, just kept sipping my tea. Something about the way he asked, the way he looked at me. It didn't feel like small talk anymore. It felt like he was taking notes. He mentioned how he moves around a lot, never stays too long in one place, so he likes calm places and people who don't cause problems. I just gave a small nod and said, "Yeah, peace and quiet is good." I was still smiling on the outside, but inside, my mind was racing. Why did it feel like he was testing the waters? Like he was trying to figure out how alone I really was. That night I lay in bed thinking through the whole conversation. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe he was just trying to build rapport, and I was being weird because I'd had bad experiences with past tenants. I've had people throw parties, leave the place a mess, even one who stopped paying rent. Maybe I was just being overly cautious this time. Still, I decided I'd be a bit more careful. I locked my bedroom door, something I hadn't done in years. The next morning, I walked through the house and tried to see if anything seemed out of place. Nothing did. Everything looked normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be alert. I told myself it was probably nothing, but I wasn't going to let my guard down. Not yet. Then something happened that I really didn't expect. One morning, I was doing laundry, just going about my usual routine, and I noticed this small device sitting on top of the washing machine. At first glance, it looked like a flash drive, but something about it seemed off. There was a tiny lens on one side, like a miniature camera. My first thought was that maybe someone had left it by accident, or it fell out of someone's pocket. But the way it was positioned, just barely tucked behind the detergent bottle, didn't seem like an accident. My stomach dropped. I picked it up carefully and turned it over in my hands. It wasn't a regular flash drive, and it wasn't something I'd ever seen before. I looked around the laundry room, my eyes scanning everything. Walls, shelves, ceiling corners. That's when I noticed a small hole under the bathroom cabinet, just next to the laundry area. It wasn't big, just a pinhole, but close enough that a small wire could run through it. I leaned down and saw a thin black wire disappearing into the wall. My heart was pounding now, and I felt sweat breaking out across my back. I couldn't believe it. Was someone recording me? Had he installed hidden cameras? My hands were shaking as I backed out of the room. I didn't know what to do. I called a friend of mine, Pavel, who works in IT and knows about electronics. He came over that same day, took one look at the device, and said it was a wireless camera, battery-operated, capable of streaming video. He found another one hidden behind a vent cover in the bathroom. Pavel didn't sugarcoat it. He said someone had set this up deliberately to record and possibly stream video from inside my house. We checked the other rooms, but nothing else was obvious. Still, just knowing those two devices were there was enough. I felt sick, like the walls themselves had been watching me. I kept thinking back to all the moments I thought I was alone, the times I felt watched. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been spying on me. I called the police immediately. They took the report seriously and came over within the hour. Andre wasn't home at the time, which I was grateful for. The officers asked me about everything. When I first noticed the device, how long he'd been living there, if I'd noticed any strange behavior. I told them everything, and they decided to search his room. They had the authority since it was my house, and I gave permission. Inside his room, they found his laptop on the desk. One of the officers opened it, and there it was, a folder right on the desktop. The names of the folders chilled me. One was labeled bathroom, another bedroom. They clicked through and there were videos, not just one or two, dozens. Some from my house, others that looked like they were filmed in different places entirely. Different houses, different people. Some looked like they'd been taken in hotel rooms. The officers looked grim, said this wasn't their first case like this. Apparently, he wasn't just some amateur creep. Further investigation revealed that he'd used multiple fake names and fake documents. The ID he gave me wasn't his. He had a history of moving frequently, never staying in one place too long. On his browser, there was a search history that included how to keep a roommate from calling the police and hidden camera installation tips. The more they uncovered, the worse it got. He'd been doing this for a while, and I was just another person on his list. By the time Andre returned that evening, the police were waiting. He walked in like it was just another day, but when he saw them, he froze. They told him he was being detained for questioning, and he immediately started denying everything. He said the devices weren't his, that the laptop wasn't his, that the equipment was part of his job. One of the officers told him to save it. They had enough to charge him already. The videos were time-stamped, and his face was visible in many of them as he installed the cameras. They arrested him on the spot. He didn't resist, but he kept talking, saying things like, "You've got it all wrong," and "I didn't hurt anyone." But the files on the laptop told a different story. He'd been filming people without their knowledge, invading their privacy, for months, maybe years. Some of the videos even had him talking in the background, whispering to himself as he adjusted the cameras. It made my skin crawl just to think about it. The police thanked me for reporting it and said I probably stopped him from doing it to someone else. Still, I couldn't sleep in that house after that. I packed a bag and stayed at my friend's place for a while. Every creak, every sound, I thought it was him coming back somehow. It took weeks before I could walk into my bathroom without scanning every inch for hidden devices. I never rented out the room again. I don't even let people I barely know into my house anymore. I check everything: smoke detectors, vents, behind mirrors. Maybe I'm paranoid now, but I'd rather be safe than go through something like that again. It's crazy how someone can seem so normal, so polite, and still be capable of something that disgusting. Renting out a room seemed like such a simple way to make extra money. I never imagined it would end like that. Every morning on my way to work, I'd stop by this small coffee stand by the side of the road. Just one of those simple setups: metal frame, faded awning, a couple of folding chairs, and the smell of coffee hanging heavy in the air. It became a bit of a ritual for me. I'd grab a cup of coffee, sit in my car for 5 minutes, and try to enjoy those few calm moments before diving into the chaos of the office. The guy who ran the place was this older man, gray hair, always smiling. Friendly, talkative type, you know the kind. He always called me by my name, which was weird because I never told it to him. Maybe he overheard me talking to a coworker. Sometimes others from the office would stop there too. But I don't really know. He had this routine, always asking about my plans for the day, cracking jokes. I'd answer on autopilot, not really paying much attention. It was just morning small talk, nothing special. But then one morning, things got a little odd. I ordered my usual, reached for my wallet, and he waved me off, saying, "Don't worry about it, it's already paid." I paused, kind of confused, asked, "What do you mean?" He just smiled and repeated, "It's covered." I didn't want to argue, and I figured maybe he was doing some kind of promotion or loyalty reward. So I took the coffee, thanked him, and went on my way. Thought it was a nice gesture. Didn't think twice. A couple of days later, I stopped by again, and the same thing happened. Ordered the coffee, went to pay, and he waved me off. "Already paid," he said again. This time I hesitated. I told him, "Hey, I really don't mind paying. It's not a big deal." He frowned, like actually frowned, not joking, not smiling, and said, "It's taken care of." There was this tension in his voice that didn't sit right with me. Not angry, just stiff. I kind of laughed, tried to lighten the mood, said something like, "You'll spoil me if you keep this up." He didn't laugh, didn't even smile. Just handed me the cup and turned to the next customer. The next morning, I pulled in as usual, but when I got to the stand, he looked right past me and started serving the guy behind me. Didn't even acknowledge me. I waited a second, thinking maybe he didn't see me, but no, he was definitely skipping me on purpose. I stepped forward, said, "Hey, just the usual please," and put a couple of bills on the counter. He stared at the money for a second, then reluctantly took it and started making the drink. His face was hard, none of that usual friendliness. When he handed me the cup, he shoved the change at me fast, and half the coins slipped out and clattered onto the asphalt. I crouched down to pick them up, trying not to make it a thing, but he didn't say a word. Just turned away and started talking to the next guy in line like nothing happened. I stood up, pocketed the change, and walked back to my car, not really sure what to make of it. It wasn't some huge scene or anything, but it left me unsettled. The guy was acting different, and I couldn't tell why. Something about the way he looked at me, like I'd broken some kind of unspoken rule, even though I didn't think I did anything wrong. Just wanted to pay for my coffee like always. I told myself it was probably nothing, just a misunderstanding, or maybe he was having a bad day. But still, that morning stuck in my head. The way the coins hit the ground, the way he looked at me when I insisted on paying. It felt off. I didn't think it was a real problem at the time, but something about it lingered, like a warning I didn't quite understand. A few days later, I noticed something wrong with my car. It was parked in the lot behind my apartment building, where it always was. As I approached, I saw the driver's door wasn't closed properly. When I tried to open it, it moved too easily, and I realized the lock had been tampered with. Scratches around the keyhole, and the mechanism felt loose. I checked the trunk, nothing missing. Glove box untouched. But in the front seat, on the dashboard, was a single piece of paper, folded in half. I opened it. Written in thick, uneven letters was, "You didn't say thank you." I just stood there holding it for a second, trying to process. It was like someone punched me in the gut. I looked around the lot. No one around, just a couple of other parked cars. I got in and drove straight to the local police station, showed them the lock, the note. The officer took my statement, but there wasn't much to go on. No fingerprints on the note, no cameras in the lot. He said maybe it was some local punks messing around, or someone tried to steal from me and just left a weird message as a joke. I wanted to believe that, but the only person I could think of, the only one who might feel slighted, was the old man at the coffee stand. The whole thing wouldn't leave my mind. It felt too specific to be random. That phrase, "You didn't say thank you," connected too clearly to what happened. I debated not stopping for coffee again, but part of me needed to know. The next morning I drove past the usual spot, expecting to see him there like always. But the stand was closed, locked up, tarp covering the counter. No sign of life. It was weird because he usually opened early, before sunrise even. Seeing it shut down made my stomach twist. It wasn't just a day off. It felt wrong, like he knew I'd be coming. That night, when I got home from work, I saw it. On the wall next to my building entrance, sprayed in red paint. "Say thank you." Big, crude letters, dripping down the concrete. My throat went dry. This wasn't some random act anymore. Someone was targeting me, and it wasn't subtle. I scanned the street but didn't see anyone. Inside, I double-locked my door, checked every window, didn't even bother with dinner. I sat at the kitchen table, heart racing, trying to think clearly. The next day I talked to my neighbor, an older guy who lived across the hall. I told him about the car, the note, the graffiti. He didn't seem surprised, just told me I should get a camera set up. Maybe one of those doorbell ones that records everything. Made sense, so I ordered one online that day. Later, I called a friend from work, someone who sometimes bought coffee at the same stand. When I mentioned the owner acting weird, my friend got quiet. Then he told me something I didn't know, that he'd heard from another guy at the office that the old man had trouble before. Apparently, he had some history of getting too attached to certain regulars, treating them like favorites. If they didn't act grateful or close with him, things got tense. I didn't know if it was true or just rumors, but suddenly everything felt heavier. The free coffee, the anger when I tried to pay, the note. It all fit. I realized I wasn't just dealing with a cranky old man. I was caught in something more twisted. It felt like he was trying to pull me into his world, and when I resisted, he decided I needed to be taught a lesson. That graffiti wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a threat. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the hallway made me tense up. Eventually, the police got back to me. They had lifted partial prints from my car door, enough to run through the system. Turned out the coffee stand owner had a record. Ex-con, released early. His charges? Stalking and harassment. The pattern was clear. He'd latch onto people, try to make them dependent, then flip when they didn't act the way he wanted. Control. That's what it was. Control disguised as kindness. They brought him in for questioning. I was asked to come down to confirm his identity. When I walked into the room and saw him behind the glass, I barely recognized him. No smile, no warmth. Just cold, flat eyes staring at me like I was nothing. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't. The only thing he said was, "You didn't understand my kindness." His voice was low, calm, but the words made my skin crawl. It wasn't about coffee. It was about power, about making me play along. Now that he's gone, I'm still cautious. I don't take friendly gestures at face value anymore. I stay alert, pay attention to people who try too hard to be close. That whole experience taught me that sometimes the biggest threats don't come with warnings. They come with a smile and a free coffee. And if you're not careful, something that starts as harmless routine can spiral into something you never saw coming. I live in a small house outside of town. Not too far, maybe 20 minutes by car, but far enough that it's mostly woods and silence around here. Neighbors are few and far between, like you can maybe see the edge of someone's roof through the trees if the leaves are down in winter. But that's about it. I work remotely, which means I'm in the house most of the time, alone. It's quiet, peaceful for the most part. I've got my routine, and usually I don't mind the isolation. This happened on a Thursday evening. Nothing special, just one of those normal days when I'd finished work around 6 p.m., made a quick dinner, and was ready to crash on the couch for the night. The plan was to binge a few episodes of some show, maybe have a glass of wine, and just relax. I had just sat down and grabbed the remote when my phone rang. I checked the screen. Unknown number. I hesitated for a second but picked it up. The man on the other end sounded polite at first. He said he was from a delivery service and that he was trying to find my house. He told me he was nearby but couldn't see the address clearly and asked if I could step outside to wave so he could spot me. At first, I was just confused because I hadn't ordered anything. Not recently anyway. I told him that and asked if he might have the wrong number. But he kept going, saying, "I've got a bunch of stops tonight and I'm trying to finish up. I just need you to come out for a second so I can confirm I'm in the right place." His voice was steady, not aggressive, just firm, like he was used to people making his job harder. I stood up and walked to the front window, peeking out through the blinds. The road outside was empty. No headlights, no engine noise, nothing. My house sits a bit back from the road, maybe 50 feet of gravel driveway, and from where I stood I could see the end of it clearly. No car there. I told him again that I hadn't ordered anything, and if he had the wrong address, he should check it, or maybe call his office. That's when the tone shifted. He didn't argue, didn't even speak at first. There was just this heavy breathing on the other end. Not exaggerated, not cartoonish, just slow and deliberate. That's when something clicked in my head. I don't know if it was fear exactly, but I got this urge to end the call immediately. I said, "I'm not coming out. Goodbye." And I hung up. But now I couldn't sit still. Something about the way he went silent, the breathing. There was something off about it. I walked through the house quickly, making sure all the doors were locked. I didn't want to turn on the lights because I realized that if someone was outside, it'd be easy to see where I was inside the house. The only light came from the TV, which I switched off right after. I moved to the kitchen, staying low, and peeked through the blinds there too. Still nothing. Part of me wanted to believe it was just some screw-up, a real delivery guy who got the wrong number and just didn't know how to deal with it. But the way he insisted I come outside, the silence after I pushed back, it didn't feel right. I stayed by the kitchen window, watching the road. A few minutes later, I heard a noise near the back door, like someone was trying the handle. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Metal moving, a slight rattle, like a hand trying to test if the door was locked. My whole body tensed. I didn't look, didn't check, just grabbed my phone and dialed 911 immediately. The call connected fast, and I kept my voice low, told them someone was at my back door trying to get in. The operator was calm, asking for my address and confirming details. She said they would dispatch a car right away, but because of my location, it might take some time. I switched to speakerphone and crouched behind the couch in the living room, keeping low so I couldn't be seen from the windows. I could still hear the sound at the back door, scratching, small movements near the lock. He was trying to get in, for sure. Those couple of minutes dragged. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. I was ready to run to the front door if I had to, but I didn't know if that would make things worse. Then, suddenly, it went quiet. No more noise at the door, no movement outside. I stayed behind the couch, still listening, trying to hear if he was moving around the house. I didn't hear footsteps, but maybe he realized the door wouldn't budge or guessed I might have called the cops. After maybe another minute, I heard a car engine start, not loud, but close. I crawled to the front window and barely lifted the blinds. A dark car was pulling away slowly, no lights on, just rolling down the road until it vanished into the trees. 20 minutes later, the police finally arrived. 2 officers checked around the house with flashlights, walked the perimeter, and examined the doors. The back door handle had marks on it, fresh scratches near the lock. But the guy was gone, and without a camera or witnesses, they told me it'd be hard to prove anything. They advised me to stay alert and call again if anything suspicious happened. The next day, I bought a basic camera system. It wasn't top of the line or anything, but it covered all the doors and part of the driveway. I set it up myself, made sure it was recording, and installed an extra latch on the back door, the kind that couldn't be picked from outside. I figured it was a one-time thing, maybe some drifter or random person passing through. But a couple of days later, I checked the footage out of habit. Nothing at first, just usual movement from squirrels or wind, until I saw a clip from the previous night around 2:30 a.m. The camera by the back door had picked up movement. I clicked the video. It was him. A shadow moved close to the door, slow and careful. The night vision wasn't perfect, but I could see he was holding something. Looked like a phone or maybe a small radio. He stood by the door, head low, like he was listening. Then he reached for the handle again and tried the door, twisting it softly. He was there for maybe a minute, then stopped, paused, and walked away out of frame. He didn't get in this time. The new latch held. But he came back. That was clear. I sent the video to the police right away. They responded quickly this time. They said the footage was helpful and that now they could issue a bulletin. The image wasn't perfectly clear, but it was enough to identify the shape of the car, and they were able to pull plates from nearby road cameras. They caught him 3 days later. Turns out he was already on their radar for similar break-ins. His method was the same every time. Find isolated houses, call as a delivery or maintenance guy, and try to lure the person outside. If that didn't work, he'd attempt to get inside. He'd done it in 2 other towns before moving into my area. The cops said I did the right thing, that the video and the call helped build the case. He was charged with attempted break-in and a few other things. Apparently, there's enough to keep him locked up for a long while. I still keep the cameras running, and I don't go outside after dark anymore, not without checking first. Living alone out here seemed ideal before, peaceful and quiet. But now I know how fast that peace can turn into danger. When something goes wrong, there's no one nearby, no neighbors close enough to hear or see. If I hadn't trusted my gut, hadn't locked that door, hadn't called when I did, it could have gone a lot worse. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I pulled over on the side of a dark, empty stretch of highway because I saw a woman holding a sign that said, "Help, child is sick." She looked like she hadn't slept in days, standing there with a big old duffel bag at her feet, clothes hanging off her like she hadn't eaten properly in a while. There was no car around, nothing but the woods on both sides of the road and the sound of insects. I was heading home from work, dead tired. but something about the way she looked made me slow down. I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and when I see stuff about kids suffering, it hits me harder now. I pulled over and rolled down the window a bit. I asked if she was okay, if her kid was nearby, and she nodded quickly, said her son was very sick and they were trying to get to a hospital in the next town over. She said they ran out of money, had been trying to hitch a ride for hours, and no one stopped. She didn't cry or beg, just stood there looking like she was about to fall over. I asked where the kid was, and she pointed at the duffel bag, said he was lying down behind the bushes, trying to sleep because he was weak. I didn't get out of the car, just leaned out a little, squinting toward the bushes, but I couldn't see anything. She must have noticed me looking because she said he's shy, doesn't want to be seen when he's not feeling good. I felt uneasy, but I didn't think she was dangerous or anything. She seemed more desperate than anything else. I didn't want to leave her out there, especially if there was a sick kid involved, so I pulled some bills out of my wallet, maybe 40 or 50 bucks, and handed them to her. She looked surprised, said, "Thank you," real quiet, and held the money like it was the first time anyone helped her in weeks. Before I drove off, I told her if things got worse, or if she needed a ride or something later, she could call me. I gave her my number, wrote it down on an old receipt I had in the car. She took it without saying much, just nodded and stepped back. As I pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror. She was still standing there, looking at the money in her hand, not moving. I drove the rest of the way home kind of zoned out, thinking about my daughter, wondering what I'd do if I was ever in that situation. By the time I got home, I was too tired to think about it more. I just collapsed into bed, woke up a few hours later when my alarm went off. The next day was busy from the start. I had to get my daughter ready for school, pack her lunch, then make it to my shift on time. The morning passed in a blur. Work was non-stop, and by the time the afternoon came around, I'd almost forgotten about that woman on the highway. I picked my daughter up every day, always waited outside the school gate because she liked to see me there when the bell rang. It gave her a sense of routine, which was important since her mom left. That evening, I got there early, maybe 10 minutes before the kids were let out. It was a bit cloudy. Air smelled like it might rain. I parked across the street from the school, leaned against the car while checking some messages. Then I saw her. At first, I didn't believe it. Thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks. But when I looked again, it was definitely her. The same woman from the highway. She didn't have the cardboard sign now, and she wasn't carrying the duffel bag. But I recognized her face, the way she held herself, like she was trying not to be noticed. She was standing half hidden near the corner of the school building, just past the parking lot, like she was waiting for someone. Not in line with the other parents, not looking for her kid. Just standing, watching the front entrance where the students come out. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could tell from her body language she was focused on the school door. I stared for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. What were the odds? Maybe she lived nearby? Maybe her kid went to the same school? I was about to walk over, say something, when she suddenly turned her head and our eyes met. Her whole face changed. She looked like she didn't expect to see me there. Without hesitation, she turned on her heel and started walking fast down the street, away from the school, not running, but moving quick like she didn't want to get stopped. I stayed by the car, just watching her disappear down the sidewalk, feeling something cold settle in my gut, like something wasn't adding up. 2 days later, my daughter came home from school and said something that stopped me cold. She told me there was a woman standing near the school gate the last couple of days who didn't look like any of the other parents. She's got long dark hair and wears a big jacket, she said. She just stands there and looks at us. That matched exactly what I saw earlier, and now hearing it from my kid made the situation feel real in a different way. I asked if the woman had talked to her or come close. My daughter said no, but that some of the other kids had been whispering about her, saying she was always there, never picking anyone up. That night I couldn't shake it. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Something about the way the woman looked at the school, how she reacted when she saw me, didn't sit right. The next morning, after dropping my daughter off, I went straight to the principal's office. I explained everything, how I'd seen the woman on the highway, how she'd been watching the school, and now how my daughter noticed her too. The principal didn't take it lightly. She said they'd increase security, let the staff and security guards know to watch out, and that if someone loitered again near the kids, they'd contact the police immediately. I left the school feeling a bit better, but my stomach was still in knots the rest of the day. Work was a blur. I kept looking at the clock, counting the hours until pickup. I kept thinking, why a school? Why stand there if she didn't have a kid? Women holding signs asking for help don't usually end up outside random elementary schools. Something wasn't adding up. That evening I stayed by the school longer, watching everyone leave. I didn't see her that time, but the unease didn't go away. Later that night I tried calling the number I gave her, just to see if she'd pick up, maybe get some kind of explanation, or at least hear her voice again to confirm it all. But when I dialed it, I got a message saying the number wasn't in service. I double-checked it, tried again, same result. That's when the fear really hit me. She never intended to use the number. Maybe she gave me fake details on purpose. The next morning at school, the atmosphere felt different. A group of parents were standing by the gate, talking in low voices, looking worried. I went over, and one of the moms pulled me aside. She said a woman none of them recognized had been seen talking to a couple of kids, offering them candy if they followed her. One of the older kids ran and told a teacher, and by the time staff came out, she was gone. Another parent had tried to take a picture of her, but she noticed and slipped away before they could. My heart started pounding. I asked what she looked like. The description was exactly the same. I called the police right away, told them everything, from the moment I saw her on the highway to now. 2 officers came to meet me that same day. They asked me for every detail I could remember, what she looked like, what car she had, if I saw her with any kid, where exactly I met her. When I told them I gave her cash and my number, they looked serious. One of them asked if I knew she'd been spotted in other towns. I shook my head. The officer said that in a nearby state, they had reports of a woman using a similar story to gain sympathy. Sick child, no money, help needed, and then being seen near schools and playgrounds. In one case, a child had gone missing for hours before being found. They couldn't prove it was her yet, but the pattern was too similar to ignore. 2 days later, the police called again. They'd picked up a woman matching her description in another city. She was loitering near a school again. Some staff had called it in, and the local police detained her. When questioned, she wouldn't say much. Denied everything. Refused to talk about the sick child or her presence at multiple schools. But based on reports, they were connecting her to several incidents. Luckily, my daughter hadn't been hurt. The school stayed on alert, and I decided I couldn't take any more chances. I transferred her to a different school closer to our apartment, with better security and a more controlled pickup process. It wasn't convenient for me. It added time to my commute, but I didn't care. Looking back, I hate how close I came to letting something horrible happen. I thought I was helping someone in need, and maybe part of me still hopes she was just desperate and lost. But the facts say otherwise. I know now how easy it is to be targeted when you're alone with a kid, when you let your guard down for just a moment because you feel sorry for someone. That's the part that still eats at me. My kindness almost opened a door for something dangerous to walk right into our lives. I'm just glad I caught the signs early and didn't ignore them. Sometimes helping someone isn't as simple as handing over some cash and wishing them well. Sometimes it's a trap, and the price can be too high. The night I heard screaming through the wall, I almost called the police. It was past midnight. I was lying in bed half asleep when I caught this muffled sound, kind of like yelling but not loud enough to make out words. At first, I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but then I realized it was from the apartment across the shared balcony walkway. A woman lived there, young, maybe late 20s, but I didn't know much about her. Just that she kept to herself and didn't talk to neighbors. I'd nod at her if we crossed paths, but that was about it. I'd moved into this apartment building about 3 weeks before. It was an older place, 5 floors, thin walls, and all the balconies connected by this long, narrow walkway that ran along the backside of the building. Each unit had a sliding glass door to access it. My unit was small, just a 1-bedroom, but it faced a green courtyard with trees, which I liked. I worked from home, doing IT support, so I was in my apartment basically 24/7. At first, I spent most of my time unpacking, setting up my workspace, getting used to the sounds of the building. There was the usual stuff: footsteps in the hall, kids yelling, someone's TV too loud. Nothing out of the ordinary. The woman across the walkway, though, I noticed early on she didn't go out much. Her blinds stayed closed, and I almost never saw her in the hallway. A couple of times I saw her through the glass door when I stepped out for a smoke on the balcony, but she always seemed to be alone. I figured she just liked privacy. No big deal. I wasn't trying to make friends anyway. That night, hearing the muffled shouting, I sat up and listened harder. The sound stopped pretty quickly. I thought maybe I imagined it, but then I heard a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. It was brief. Just that sound, then silence again. I waited, trying to decide if I should do something, but then it went quiet. I didn't hear footsteps, no doors opening, nothing. I stayed awake for another hour, just listening, but it didn't happen again. The next morning, I felt a bit awkward when I saw her from my window, standing in her kitchen. She looked normal, calm. No signs of anything weird the night before. I told myself maybe she had someone over, maybe they had a fight. It wasn't my business. I didn't want to be the kind of neighbor who gets involved in stuff without a reason. Still, that sound stuck in my head all day. After that, I started noticing the noises more often. About 2 or 3 times a week, always at night, there'd be the same pattern. Raised voices, something slamming, then silence. It wasn't loud enough to be obvious, but my bedroom shared a wall with her unit, and when everything else was quiet, I could hear just enough to know it wasn't right. Some nights it sounded like things being knocked over or thrown, but every day after, things seemed totally normal. No one else in the building seemed to care. No police ever came. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People argue. Maybe she had a boyfriend who visited only at night. But here's the thing. I never saw anyone come or go from her apartment, and like I said, I was home all day, every day. I worked by the window, and the walkway was right outside. If someone was coming in or out, I'd see it. But I never did. Not once. One evening around 7 p.m., I stepped out onto the shared balcony to stretch my legs. It was getting dark, and most people had their curtains drawn. I glanced across the walkway and noticed her sliding glass door was slightly open. She was inside, standing near it. But as soon as she noticed me, she reached up and yanked it shut, pulling the curtain across in one quick motion. It was abrupt, like she didn't want me to see anything. But just before the curtain closed, I saw something in the glass. A reflection, not clear, but there was someone else in the room with her. A man. He was standing behind her, not moving and not speaking, just standing. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shape, the outline and the reflection, but he was definitely there. As soon as she turned toward the glass door, I quickly stepped back, hoping she didn't realize I saw anything. I moved back into the shadow of my own unit, heart racing, not because of fear exactly, but because something wasn't adding up. She was supposed to be living alone. That was in the lease. Single occupancy. Same as mine. I remember because the landlord made a point of explaining the rules during the signing. After that, I didn't go back onto the balcony for a few days. I kept an eye out from inside instead, staying behind the blinds. But even with all my watching, that man, whoever he was, never left the apartment. Not through the front hall, not through the balcony. Nothing. After a few days of hearing those late-night disturbances again, I figured I had to at least talk to someone else in the building, see if anyone knew more about her or noticed the same things. I started small, casually asking a neighbor across the hall during a smoke break if they knew the woman in 3B. He just shrugged and said she kept to herself. Same response from the older lady on the first floor. Quiet girl, keeps to herself, just moved in not long ago. No one had a last name, no details. The only consistent thing was that she'd told everyone she liked privacy. That didn't help much, but I still couldn't shake the feeling something was off. One afternoon, I rang her doorbell. No special reason. I just said I lived across the walkway and could help with anything she might need. Moving furniture, heavy stuff. She didn't open the door, just answered through the intercom. Her voice was calm, no hesitation. "Everything's fine, thank you," she said, and the line cut. I stared at the door for a second, then walked back to my place. A few days later, while checking the mailboxes downstairs, I noticed something odd. Her box had only a first name on it. Anna. No last name, no initials. Just that. It struck me as strange. If someone else lived there, they'd be getting mail too, or packages. But that box was always empty except for small letters addressed only to her. That night, I was on edge again, and sure enough, around 1 a.m., it started. Louder this time, clearer. Shouting, angry, then something hitting the wall, hard. I stood still, frozen by the sound. It was like furniture getting knocked over. I didn't know what to do. Without proof, calling the police felt risky, like I could be making it worse if I was wrong. But the images in my mind weren't letting me sleep. A couple days after that night, I ran into her in the hallway by chance. She turned the corner and almost walked straight into me. I guess I reacted too fast, because I immediately asked, "Hey, everything okay in your place?" She smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was tight, forced. She said, "Oh, just loud music sometimes. Sorry if it's bothering you." Then she turned and walked away before I could say anything else. I wanted to let it go, but something didn't feel right. After that, I started watching more carefully. Not just her apartment, but her movements. In the early mornings, I noticed she'd slip out to the trash bins when the building was quiet. She'd glance around, check the walkway, like making sure no one was there. It wasn't random. She was being careful. That, more than anything, made me think there was someone else in there. Someone she didn't want anyone to know about. It was building up in my head that maybe, just maybe, she was hiding someone. And not in some casual way. The kind of hiding that involved fear or threats, or worse. I didn't want to think it, but with every sound, every strange move she made, it felt more real. I started worrying that someone was trapped in there, held against their will. That maybe what I'd been hearing wasn't just arguments, but someone trying to escape. Still, I kept telling myself that was crazy. That stuff didn't happen in real life, until one night it finally went too far. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a bang so loud I jumped out of bed. It wasn't just arguing, it was a fight. Furniture scraping, something heavy slamming against the wall, voices yelling over each other. A man's voice for sure, and hers too, but I couldn't tell what they were saying. It was chaos. Then another crash, this one sounding like glass breaking. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police. I told them something violent was happening in the unit across from mine. They said they'd send a patrol car immediately. I waited at my window, heart pounding, watching the walkway. 15 minutes later, I saw the flashing lights pull up to the building. 2 officers came up and knocked on her door. No answer at first. They knocked again, harder, then pounded. From inside I could hear the shouting, muffled, then someone cursing. Finally the door opened a crack. I couldn't see inside, just heard voices talking, low and tense. The officers stepped in. A few minutes passed, then they came out with both of them, her and a man I'd never seen before. He looked rough, disheveled, and angry. She looked pale, like all the energy had drained from her. The police kept them separated and talked to each one for a while, then led them both down the stairs. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, a neighbor told me what happened. The man was her brother. He'd been hiding out in her apartment for weeks. Turns out, he was wanted for violent crimes, and she'd been helping him stay under the radar. The fights were real, constant, because she was scared he'd be caught, and he was scared too. The police found the place trashed inside, broken things everywhere, signs of long-term tension. Knowing that I'd been living right across from someone dangerous, someone capable of serious violence, shook me. That I'd heard all of it through the wall, night after night, not knowing how close I was to something much worse. It's something I still think about. I was a bystander to their nightmare, and it could have ended a lot differently. I've lived alone in a small house for years now. Everybody on my street knows me. I'm the friendly old lady who always bakes pies and chats with neighbors when the weather's good. Nothing special about me or my place. Life is slow, quiet, and usually predictable. The kind of quiet that you don't really notice until something breaks the pattern. About a week ago, I started noticing the hallway light flickering. It wasn't constant. Just every now and then it would blink a few times and then stay steady. At first, I figured it was just the bulb, so I swapped it out. Same problem. Then I started thinking it could be something with the wiring. I called the municipal service line to request someone to come and take a look, but after a couple of days, still no one showed up. It was frustrating, but I'm used to things moving slow. I waited. Then, around mid-afternoon one day, someone knocked on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it just a crack, and standing there was a man in what looked like a fire department uniform. Dark blue, some kind of badge clipped to his chest and a patch on the sleeve. He said he was from the fire inspection department, and that they'd received a complaint about a potential electrical hazard at my address. Something about suspected short-circuiting. I was caught off guard. I hadn't called the fire department, just the general maintenance office. But the flickering light could look like an issue from the outside, I thought. Maybe someone reported it. He seemed professional enough, calm voice, even carried a clipboard with papers. I asked him if he had ID and he held up the badge for a second, real quick, before tucking it back. Not long enough for me to really read anything. But at the moment, I didn't think much of it. He stepped back and said, "It's important we check it out right away, ma'am. Electrical faults can become dangerous fast." I hesitated, but eventually opened the door. He stepped inside, wiped his feet politely, and asked where my circuit box was. I pointed him to the narrow hallway near the kitchen where the panel was, and he walked over, squatted down, opened it up, and started poking around. He used a small flashlight and a tool, not sure what kind, but he was moving wires around gently and inspecting them. After a couple of minutes, he stood up and said, You're right on the edge of something serious here. I can't say when it'll go bad, but this isn't safe." He seemed concerned, serious. I nodded, kind of uneasy now. He continued, "If you want, I can do the repairs myself. Off the books, won't cost you as much as going through the city." He gave me a small smile, like he was doing me a favor. I told him I didn't have any cash right now and that I'd wait for the official maintenance worker. He stiffened up just a bit, but then shrugged and said, "All right, it's your call. Just don't wait too long. Things like this can go bad real fast." He walked out with a quick goodbye, looking slightly annoyed, like I was being careless. I locked the door behind him and sat down, trying to think if I'd made the right decision. Something about the whole thing sat weird with me, but I didn't have proof he wasn't who he said he was. 2 days passed. I still hadn't heard back from the city office. Then, the light in the small back room, where I keep old books and sewing stuff, went out completely. I tried switching the bulb again, but nothing. The power was dead in just that room. I started to feel more worried. I checked the breaker panel myself, but I couldn't make sense of it. I thought about calling that guy back but decided against it. Instead, I called the municipal line again and left another request. Still no reply. That night, I was lying in bed, not asleep yet, just resting, when I heard a faint cracking noise. At first, I thought it was from outside, a branch or something, but then I smelled it. Faint, but there. Smoke. I sat up fast, put on my slippers, and stepped into the hallway. The air felt thicker. The flickering light was off completely now, and I could smell it stronger, coming from the wall itself near the panel. I opened my front door and called for help. One of my neighbors, a younger guy from across the street, came running. He smelled it too, and didn't waste time. He called the fire department. Within minutes, real firefighters arrived, lights flashing, and they went straight to work. They opened up the wall near the panel, and sure enough, there was smoldering inside. Some wires had burned through part of the wooden beam. They managed to put it out before it spread, but they said it could have been worse if we'd waited. After things calmed down, I asked one of the firefighters if they could inspect the rest of the wiring, just to be safe. One of the firemen took a closer look at the panel after they put out the smoldering. He shined a flashlight into the burned section, pulling at some of the melted insulation with a tool, and then paused. He called another guy over. They both examined it for a bit, whispering back and forth. Then one of them turned to me and said, "Ma'am, this wasn't just faulty wiring. These wires have been deliberately damaged. Someone cut them." I just sat down on the nearest chair, stunned. I thought it was just some old cables gone bad, a random accident. But now, hearing it was intentional, I couldn't believe it. They asked me if anyone had been in the house recently, maybe pretending to be with the fire department. Right away, my mind jumped to that so-called inspector. I described him as best I could. The uniform, the badge, his voice, the way he walked and spoke. I even remembered the name tag, though I hadn't had enough time to read it properly. The two firefighters exchanged a look, and one said, "We don't have anyone like that in our department. No one was sent out for inspections here this week." That hit me hard. I realized I'd let someone into my house who had no business being there. Someone who likely caused the fire on purpose. It didn't seem real at first. Why would anyone do that? Then I started piecing it together. He must have damaged the wiring when he was inspecting it, hoping it would cause trouble later. Maybe he expected I'd get desperate and call him back, and then he could charge me for expensive repairs or pretend to fix it while doing more harm. It sounded insane, but the evidence was right there. Cut wires, fake credentials, and a house that almost burned down. I felt sick just thinking about it. He hadn't come to help. He came with a plan. While the wiring was being repaired and the smoke damage cleaned up, I stayed with my neighbor across the street. She was kind enough to offer her guest room, and I didn't want to be alone in that house after what happened. Meanwhile, the police were working on finding the guy. They asked me for every detail I could remember: his face, his clothes, anything odd about his behavior. I didn't have much, but I gave them all I could. Then, they told me that I wasn't the only one. Turns out, there had been a string of similar incidents around the city. Small fires breaking out in homes of elderly people, all of them living alone. And in almost every case, someone posing as a fire inspector had shown up beforehand. He'd offered to fix wiring problems for a ridiculous amount of money, and if they refused, something always happened not long after: a fire, smoke damage, or sudden power failures. I couldn't believe the level of planning involved. This wasn't some random thief. This was someone who carefully targeted the most vulnerable, using fear and urgency to get into homes. What scared me most was how normal he had seemed. He wasn't aggressive, didn't act strange. He was calm, polite, professional. That's what made it work. I remembered how I hadn't felt threatened at all when he was in my house. He even smiled. That's what got to me. He didn't need to scare people. He made them trust him. The police assured me they were actively looking for him and had a few leads. They believed he was moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, trying not to stay in one place too long. After about 2 weeks, I got a call from one of the officers assigned to the case. They had caught someone matching his description, trying to pull the same trick in a different part of town. He'd approached another elderly woman, again claiming to be an inspector, but this time she got suspicious early and called the real department to confirm. He was picked up not far from her place. When they searched him, they found fake badges, tools that could be used to tamper with electrical systems, and a notebook with addresses. Mine was on it, along with several others. Hearing that shook me more than I expected. Knowing he had a list, that he'd planned it all out, and that I was just one name among many made it feel even more disturbing. I wasn't singled out. I was part of a routine. It also made me realize how easily things could have gone worse. If the fire had spread faster, if the neighbors hadn't smelled smoke, if the real firefighters hadn't come in time, I might not have been around to even tell anyone what happened. My house could have been gone, or worse. Eventually, the city paid for proper repairs through a community support program. They replaced most of the wiring and made sure everything was safe. When I finally moved back in, the house felt different. Same furniture, same walls, but it didn't feel like home for a while. For weeks, I'd wake up at night thinking I smelled smoke. I'd get up, check every room, feel the walls, look out the window. It would take me a while to calm down enough to sleep again. I don't trust strangers the way I used to. I used to open the door without thinking, smile at anyone who came by. Not anymore. Now, I double-check IDs, call departments to verify names, and never let someone in without confirmation. What I learned is that some people wear friendliness like a mask. They're not there to help. They're there to take advantage, and they count on your trust to do it. I won't let that happen again.